Hello, romance lovers. Today I have a story for you called The Hero's Daughter Avoids the Death Flag. Don't forget to support this video with a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new interesting stories. Thank you for watching. The amazing story of the main character begins with a beautiful, snow-white palace, under which there is a large fountain with aristocratic proportions, because the castle is the home of the Duke of Lindhagen. Duke Lindhagen has golden hair, a long sword, and a blue cloak. And among the people, he is a hero who is not only noble, but also protects the people from troubles, evil, and enemies, for which he is revered. However, on this day, from the very beginning, there was a lot of noise in one bedroom, which was created by the maids, worried about the Duchess, who had given birth to a child an hour ago, but was feeling very unwell and even ill. She was very pale, as if she was about to leave this life, but she still glanced away with her green eyes, because she needed to at least look at the child, the firstborn, for whom she had sacrificed her health. One of the servants, waiting with gray hair, smiled at the Duchess with a baby in her arms, telling the aristocrat that the birth had gone well, and she had given birth to a healthy girl who had the same beautiful hair as her father. The baby truly has a striking beauty because this girl's hair could seem to glow like the sun, but the baby slept soundly while others looked at her attentively and admiringly. The young mother touched her daughter's golden hair with her hand, saying with a smile that she already knew what to name her child, and now she would pronounce the name of the girl, the only heir to the ducal title. However, the mother never said what she would name her daughter because her hand fell powerlessly onto the bed, while the Duchess herself lifelessly tilted her head to the side, which greatly horrified the maids, realizing that the aristocrat was dying. A maid with gray hair and a child in her arms looked at the Duchess with an exhausted expression and shouted at her to wake up immediately, while behind her there was another maid watching her actions with suspicious calm. The same woman approached the maid and extended her hands to her, with shock on her face, saying that she would take the child on herself so that others would hurry to call the doctor, and the old maid, out of fear, said that she would do so. Thanking the freckled maid for her help, the maid immediately ran into the corridor to inform everyone about the misfortune, while the woman with the child in her arms looked at her with wide eyes. A few minutes later, several butlers and maids were already hurrying towards the Duchess's bedroom, talking about the health of the aristocrat and her health, saying that everything was really bad, because they might not have time to save her. But when everyone was busy with the aristocrat, a young mother who was about to pass away, no one even noticed how the maid with the girl in her arms quietly left the crowded place, getting ready to enter the dark corridor through the doors. She walked calmly down the corridor where there was a high, bright window, humming songs and melodies, holding a fair-haired girl in her arms and about to do something that the other maids and servants did not even suspect. With a distraught face, anger, and mockery, she looked at the baby and, laughing, said that she was lucky to be born into an aristocratic family, rich and noble, but she was unlucky to fall into her hands. The little girl with a birthmark in the shape of a rose slept peacefully and did not think about anything else, while the maid angrily said that they probably came up with a beautiful name for her, but she would never know it because she would leave her family forever. And 12 years later, the Duke still could not find his daughter. Life went on as usual, because while the aristocrats were in the palaces, ordinary slaves and workers carried heavy boxes of grain across the fields at sunset. Among them was also a little girl with long golden hair, whose strength had already left her, causing her to fall to the ground, dropping the large bag that she had been given to carry. But she was not able to rest for even a couple of minutes, because the owner came up to her from behind and hit the girl hard on the back with a whip, causing the little girl to immediately scream in pain and straighten up. Immediately after this, the owner of the girl, who was a slave in their hands, began to laugh with her friend, telling the heroine that she should appreciate their care, because if it were not for them, she would have disappeared and no one would have saved her. When the boys called the girl a useless piece of trash, she frowned in rage and anger, but continued to drag the bag on her aching back, thinking that she would become so strong that only she would decide who she was to others. The little girl knew that she had to leave here, become stronger in spirit and body, to show them her potential. But now she only looked ahead confidently and was going to drag the bag further, while a birthmark was flaunted on her body. She was able to do all the work, hard and beyond the strength of a child, after which a dark evening came, where only in a lonely house the light was burning, because it was there that the slaves and the masters lived. The blonde wanted to calmly walk past some doors, holding her stomach and thinking that her body hurt incredibly badly. But from one room, she heard the strange words of her master, saying that his deal with someone could be considered closed. The curious beauty decided to sneak a peek into the room and saw her master there, who was sitting on the sofa with a certain gentleman to whom he was smiling, thanking him for the purchase. Looking closely at the face of the gentleman with whom her master was speaking, the girl noticed a red-haired aristocrat with a mustache and an unpleasant smile. But in him, the heroine recognized the buyer of children, who this time had come to buy someone. Imagining the baby buyer as a villain with a fork in his hand, licking his lips while looking down at someone, the girl realized that she had heard rumors that all the children he bought died a very suspicious death. However, what surprised the heroine even more was that the gentleman with the purple suit continued to smile, saying that this time he decided to buy that beautiful girl. But the slave owner laughed at this, saying that it was an excellent choice. But while the main character was listening to their conversation and already understood that they needed to quickly find the child they were going to buy in order to save him, the men were sitting and the gentleman with the mustache was asking where this little girl was now. And when the owner answered that number 5 was sleeping now, but he could wake her up, the blue-eyed blonde froze in place because she heard her name, or rather, number, from the men. She didn't even notice how the door she was standing behind slowly opened and creaked, causing the frightened guy to jump up and turn around and notice the main character behind her. The 5th was so shocked that she could not utter even one word. The whole world around her was collapsing because she realized that the gentleman with the purple suit was now going to buy her and then take her life. But when the owner realized that it was only a girl, he approached her with a smile and said that she had arrived just in time, because his rich guest, rich and preferring children, really wanted to see her. The slave master was never able to touch the main character because the girl decided to run away from there as fast as she could, which greatly surprised the villager, who looked out from behind the doorway, shouting at the girl to stop. The blonde continued to run and not stop, feeling lonely in the empty, dark corridor where no one would save her and because of which that mustachioed pervert would take her with him and kill her. However, it seemed that fate itself heard her cries for help, because she was so focused on running that she did not notice a tall stranger in a cloak in front of her, into whom the lady crashed, not understanding what was happening. But the man in the dark hood only picked up the girl with his hand, which surprised the beauty, who did not realize what was happening. While behind one unknown man there was another guy in a hidden cape. Out of fear, the 5th thought that the strangers in front of her were the servants of a pervert, and so she began to nervously twitch her hands, begging them to let her go. But the man in front of her did not want to let her go. When the man realized that the girl was simply restless due to stress, he grabbed her by the chin and forced her to look at him, as if they both had just come for her and did not plan to harm her. And when the stranger was able to take a closer look at the girl's face, he immediately hugged her with sad words about having finally found her, calling the 5th his daughter and hugging her even closer to himself. The protagonist, who didn't understand anything, no longer resisted, not even knowing where to look because the words of the person unknown to her really struck her. But as soon as the man took off his hood, an aristocrat who looked very much like her appeared before the main character, smiling when the servant behind him said that there was no need to worry, because in front of her was her father, Duke Vikram. And while the 5th one did not understand anything, one gentleman had already appeared behind her, who greeted Duke Lindhagen, saying that his son was probably standing behind him, but he still wanted to take the girl for himself. The old man in the purple suit looked slyly at the Duke and said that unfortunately this girl had already been bought, and he was ready to pay a large sum for her, which made the owner behind him very happy. But this did not embarrass Duke Vikram, because he looked confidently at the men, showed them 3 fingers on his hand, holding the girl close to him and saying that he would pay 3 times more for her, because it was he who was wanted. Hearing this, the slave owner instantly became even more happy, looking at the Duke with happy eyes and asking if it was true, when next to him, the pervert with a mustache was not ready to accept his defeat. And when the man said that in that case the Duke could take the girl right now, the baby buyer got angry at everyone and rushed to the main character with a distraught face, shouting that he was not the first to buy. His hand was already near the girl's hair and could touch her at any moment, which is what the plump man wanted, because he was sure that this sweet girl would be only his thing. But he was never able to accomplish his plan, because the Duke's servant, who was standing behind his master, instantly pushed him so hard that the baby buyer fell face down on the floor. Duke Vikram's boy, whom the master had previously called his son, only angrily turned to the old man and warned him that he should not touch his father and the girl, because then he would face big problems. Duke Lindhagen decided to smile and grab his son, putting his hand on his shoulder and saying with a grin that in that case everything would be on him, also calling the boy by the name Ricardo. Right after that, the blonde decided to pick up his daughter in his arms with laughter and happiness on his face, telling her that now they would not stay here for long. while the fifth one herself reacted with shock to everything that was happening to her. The sweet couple continued to talk among themselves about how the girl was very light and seemed to eat little, but Ricardo looked at them from afar, was silent, only observing how his father, forgetting about him, gave attention only to the girl. The boy with golden eyes and black hair only remained silent, but he already understood that from that day on his father would pay less attention to him only because of his real daughter, whom he had been searching for 12 years. Meanwhile, the lady with the golden hair herself was hurriedly following her father, because he was holding her hand and leading her out of the house with a smile, while the girl was telling him that her real father was dead and she did not understand anything. But Duke Vikras only said that she looked very much like his wife, who had passed away a long time ago, because she even had that very birthmark in the form of a rose. And her father's words made the girl look at her peculiarity on her body. The blonde man with blue eyes turned to the girl and showed her a fresh spot on his neck, saying that he had the same spot and that this was direct proof that she was his daughter and he was her dad. Seeing the mark on her father's body, the girl instantly remembered Ricardo, his stern face and hair, wondering if this meant that he should have the same birthmark on his neck. But the father just continued walking towards the exit, holding the girl's hand and telling her that, unlike him and her, Ricardo doesn't have such a spot. To which the blonde asked why this happened. But Duke Vikram never answered the main character's question because he turned to her with a smile and said that now a new life awaits her, and she deserves to live the way she was previously forbidden to, in an aristocratic manner. And after some time, the father and daughter arrived in a snow-white carriage to the right place, because of which the Duke got out of the transport, holding the girl's hand and looking at something, saying that now this will be her home, while the fifth one herself carefully descended to the ground from the steps. The girl looked at the incredibly beautiful palace, in front of which stood all the servants and maids, bowing to the heroine, who just a couple of minutes ago was a slave, and now everyone lowered their heads in front of her because they knew who she was. And while the fifth one could not come to her senses due to shock, a maid suddenly approached her and bowed before her, which frightened the lady, but she only said that her name was Loria, and she would take care of her personally. The girl with bangs and dark hair smiled at the new guest and family member among the aristocrats, telling her that she would now show her her private room, take her to it, and tell her everything. The fifth, wearing only a dirty dress, came to a very large room with luxurious furniture, tables, chairs, and flowers, not believing that this was her room, while the maid Loria walked around her and smiled. The blonde with blue eyes looked at the entire bedroom with admiration and thought that it seemed like a room for a real princess, while Loria bowed behind her and said that now she needed to take a bath quickly. The maid looked at the simple girl, dirty and completely unkempt, who seemed to have just been in the field and was digging in the ground barefoot, realizing that the girl needed not only to take a bath, but also to immediately change her clothes. Therefore, in the evening, the girl was in a hot, large bath with rose petals, where she silently enjoyed the water and reflected on the events that literally turned her life upside down. In her head, she fleetingly recalled the face of the pervert who could have bought her at any moment, appropriated her, because of which she would never be free again, served the old child buyer, and then died at his hands. However, her soul immediately became warm and light when she remembered the bravery of her father, who showed the slave owners 3 fingers, saying that he was buying her from the master, thereby saving his daughter from a terrible fate. Unable to bear it any longer, the girl began to cry. Tears quickly flowed down her cheeks when she thought that she was saved and that this was not a beautiful dream, but a reality in which she was so lucky that the girl did not even believe it. Time passed, and an hour later, the Duke and her son were already sitting at a large, snow-white table because they were waiting for their daughter, so that they could have dinner together and tell each other all the most important things and share their impressions of the past day. And they didn't have to wait long, because the main character had already opened the door to the room to enter, which caused Ricardo and Vikram to look at the door, expecting the appearance of the golden-haired beauty. But the one Duke Lindhagen was in the room made him jump up from his seat and look at the guest in surprise, because his beauty was very rare and incomparable to anyone. The thing is that in front of the guys there was a very sweet and charming main character, embarrassed about something and saying that she apologizes to them for being late. But everyone was surprised only by the image of a girl in a red dress with a rose on her collar. The father approached his daughter and told her that she looked absolutely gorgeous, to which the girl said that she thanked him for this, also bowing to her father. After this, the father and daughter sat down at their places, because there were already plates for food in front of them. But the delighted Duke said that before the meal, he really wanted to ask her one question about what her name was. Then the girl, with joy on her face, loudly told everyone that her name was number 5, as if nothing embarrassed her about it. But it was so, because the lady had never seen a normal life and had never dreamed of a noble one even in her dreams. Ricardo and Vikram looked at the girl with serious faces and did not understand whether she was joking or telling the truth, as if she was not at all embarrassed by the fact that instead of a name, she was called only a number. Still looking at the lady, Ricardo apologized in advance for what might seem rude, asking the girl if it was even a name. But the heroine only answered that that was what she had always been called. But when Ricardo's father told the boy that it was impolite to argue about something with a girl and ask her for clarification on something that was clear, the boy turned away from the heroine, apologizing for his behavior, while the surprised protagonist looked at him. Duke Vikram continued to smile, telling his daughter that now she would not have to be sad, because she would have a new, more suitable name. But the blonde only looked at her dad with curiosity, preparing to hear the cherished name. And the girl continued to look at her dad in surprise when he told her that he and her mom wanted to give her a special name even at birth. And that's why her real name is Greta. But as soon as the heroine heard her real, new name, something seemed to switch in her head, because memories began to wake up one after another, and her father continued to say that he welcomed Greta Lindhagen into his home. The girl with golden hair grabbed her head in confusion, because she realized that she had heard this name before, and the memories that were emerging were about to make her remember everything. But she felt so bad and anxious that she could no longer stand it. Soon she fell to the floor because she quickly lost consciousness, which greatly frightened her father and Ricardo, shouting the girl's name and not understanding what had happened to her, because before that, everything was fine with her. Ricardo and his father kept calling the lady, but she never answered them, because I was gradually sinking into a kind of sleep that came from incredible shock and upheaval. And in his adult guise, the girl saw not only herself, but also the dark-haired, tall Ricardo, who was also an adult. But the lady was lying on the floor, because her brother had pierced her with the long blade of his sword right into her stomach. The stunned blonde, with blood flowing from her lips, looked into her brother's eyes and asked him if he was really ready to love his own sister in such a cruel way, as if she were his enemy. But Ricardo just looked into her eyes with a blank expression, continuing to hold the sword in his hands and telling his sister that she was too selfish and that it needed to be replaced earlier. But now it was too late. This is exactly what the main character was watching on TV, because she was playing a game in which she had to come to terms with a sad ending, where the main villain dies while she herself sits in front of the monitor and watches. The girl peered at the screen, which still showed the sad and tragic scene of the murder of the villainess, while the words of the characters appeared at the bottom of the screen, as if in a game novel. Being completely different, in the real world, the main character cried while watching Ricardo's character take out his sister, and she also said through tears that she was very sorry that it turned out that way. The girl peered at the screen, looked at the white-haired villainess who was already covered in blood, realizing that she was a truly bad person, and that this was exactly the fate that awaited her. But these were only memories, and therefore the main character remembered her death. Remembered how she fell to the floor from a strong blow to the head, because of which a large pool of blood appeared on the floor, and next to her lay the joystick with which the Korean woman played her favorite game. Just one memory of death in the real world made the main character wake up and jump out of bed in a new body and with a new name, but with horror on her face, because this is a real nightmare for her. She breathed nervously in her bedroom and realized that she remembered her past life and even her death very well, when the head injury was so severe that she was unable to do anything. But when the girl, with her head down, being in a light bed, was thinking about what kind of strange thing he had dreamed of her, she heard someone calling her by name. Raising her head, she noticed Ricardo opposite her, who had been sitting quietly on a chair all this time and reading a book, which he now slammed shut, asking the little girl if she had woken up from her sleep. The boy quickly got up from his chair and approached the main character, telling her that her father was very worried about her. But the lady was only very surprised by this, saying nothing. However, when the boy appeared in front of the main character, looked at her, and said that he was also very worried about her, then in her head the girl was able to remember the events from the dream, when it was he who killed her. Then her face was filled with real horror and fear that this is exactly what would happen in the future, and she would not be able to avoid it, because now she had become the very villain that would be hated. The guy noticed that the girl was not telling him anything, which made her look strange, so he asked if she was feeling well. But Greta never answered him, because she was completely afraid. Noticing the lady's strange behavior and her awakening, Ricardo said that he would immediately go and call her father, which is why the girl was left completely alone in the room, touching her palms and realizing that she now remembered everything. She got up from her bed and went to the mirror to look at herself, thinking that she had become the same villain from the game she played before she died. The girl remembered that in this game, the main character is a girl with brown, long hair who is a princess and is looking for her love, gradually getting used to life in the palace. At first glance, the game is about love, but there are also conflicts, a time of chaos and a coup d'etat, which is why the lady imagined guns and the flag of the country. Remembering herself as an adult, with a fan in her hands and an evil smile, the girl realized that she had been reborn as a villain, Ricardo's half-sister, who, according to the plot, would interfere with the princess and create problems for her. Thanks to the game, the protagonist remembered that the villainess often took out her anger on the servants, which is why the maids suffered when the golden-haired aristocrat, for example, poured hot tea on them or mocked them. Having imagined the villain in a red dress among the riches, the girl realized that according to the plot, it was she who, for her own benefit, led the country to collapse and poverty, when she herself was bathing in jewels. Because of this, her father was very ashamed of her. As if he were his daughter, covering his face with his hands and sitting in the cold in complete darkness, because his despair knew no bounds. Meanwhile, the protagonist continued to lie in bed and think about the fact that, according to the plot, it was she who wanted to kill not only the princess, the main character of the game, but also Ricardo, for which she paid with her life. Remembering how her body was pierced by a sword, the girl realized that if she was now 12 and the villain was killed at 18, then she had 6 years before this terrible event would happen. Even the thought of such a death awaiting her made the girl clutch her stomach, clearly nervous. The protagonist was also sad because in her past life she died a shameful, lousy death, because she was killed by her own father, who, under the influence of alcohol, hit her on the head with a bottle and took her life. But remembering the bad, the heroine tried to remember the good events because she managed to meet her father and brother, who, wearing dark cloaks, took her from poverty and slavery. Putting her fist on her cleavage, the girl realized that she did not want such a life, and, accordingly, did not want to die a second time so sadly and hopelessly. Imagining herself in the past and present, the girl realized that she knew the whole game well enough, because she had played it many times, and therefore she thought that she could avoid such a death as in the story. Convincing herself that she had to try to change everything, the little girl wanted to go out onto the balcony, so she slowly opened the door and looked at the blue sky, illuminating by moonlight. She gazed at the endless sky, strewn with small stars like grains in space. But of all this, the girl was only concerned about her fate, which she wanted to take into her own hands. Looking at the moon, the determined lady said that from now on she would avoid all the death flags that she was destined to encounter. However, when the girl was already leaving the balcony and returning to the room, she noticed her alarmed father, who burst into her room, throwing open the doors. He began to cry very quickly, looking at his daughter and realizing that, fortunately, she remained alive, unharmed, and he did not lose her a second time. But the main character herself looked at her dad with shock and bewilderment, because she did not expect at all that the Duke would burst into her room so hastily, as if showing that now she was incredibly important to him, like a treasure. Dad quickly approached his daughter, bent down to her and put his hands on her shoulders, telling her in a sad and worried voice that he was very worried, while Greta was surprised by his every word. The girl was even more surprised that she had slept the whole day, what her dad had told her and why the lady had looked at him in shock, only now learning everything that had happened while she was in her sleep. The girl wanted to ask her father again if she had really slept for so long, but she never finished speaking, because her father looked at her with tears in his eyes and said that if she had not woken up, he would not have known what to do. But while Duke Vikram was blaming his daughter for not being able to live without her, Ricardo had already appeared behind him, leaning against the wall and unable to catch his breath, as if he had just been running, telling his father to calm down. Since the disaster was over and everything was fine, everyone stopped worrying, deciding to put the main character back to bed, which the Duke did while Ricardo stood nearby and watched. Dad continued to stand next to the girl on his knees, telling her that they thought they shouldn't call her Greta, but rather choose a more suitable and beautiful name that she would definitely like and that wouldn't make her faint. The blue-eyed blonde looked at the girl and told her that she should have a name that she completely liked, but if such a name made her fall out of her chair and lose consciousness, it should be changed immediately. Because of these conversations, the girl imagined herself in her head when she fainted and no longer showed signs of life. But the heroine understands that because of this, she still does not want to change her name. The girl with golden hair looked thoughtfully at her father and realized that even though they had only known each other for a day, her father still thought about her and worried about her as if he had been raising her for all 12 years. Duke Vikram continued to explain to the protagonist of the story with a smile that this name was given to her by his wife, and therefore he will not be angry if she does not get used to it right away or wants to change it. Looking at the girl a little embarrassedly and giving her his smile, the aristocrat wanted to say once again that he would respect her every choice. But the lady looking at him conveyed it, addressing her by name. Placing her small palm on her cleavage, the blonde with blue eyes looked confidently at her dad and said that now her name is Greta, and she doesn't want to change anything, but only to prove that she is worthy of this name. Blushing slightly, the lady looked at her father with delight and said that she would change everything about herself, even her name, if that was what fate wanted from her, and therefore she wanted to be Greta, as her mother wanted to call her at birth. The Duke was so moved by his daughter's words that he continued to look at her with tears in his eyes and pronounce her name as if he had once again confirmed that his daughter was a real angel. After that, he hugged the girl as tightly as he could, burying his face in her shoulder and wanting to better feel Greta's warmth, her incredible kindness of soul, which she retains even when she is treated like an animal. The lady was even more surprised by every action of her father, and this time the same thing happened when her father's embrace was something unusual and amazing for her, something that she had never felt before. But Duke Vikram had no plans to let the girl go, confessing to her that he had always dreamed of a daughter who would call him daddy, and that is why he really wants to hear the cherished words from Greta, confirming that she sees him as a father. However, the girl was even more surprised by the fact that her dad thanked her even for her birth, because for him it was real happiness and joy. But when the blonde heard this, she was shocked. Remembering how she had been all alone for a long time in the darkness and loneliness, with dirty clothes and scratches on her body, the girl realized that she had hated her parents all her life for leaving her. She also remembered her alcoholic father, who took everything from her and continued to drink, beating her for the slightest offense, which is why the girl often sat on the floor, confused, blushing, not knowing what to do. And as soon as the main character quietly called the Duke her dad at least once, the aristocrat's face immediately became kinder and happier. He even cried, telling the girl that everything was right, and he really was her father. The main character was also surprised by this because her eyes became very bright and unusual, filled with love and joy when her dad began to hug her, which is why the girl did not want to let her dad go. But when dad started asking the girl to call him father for the umpteenth time without stopping, Greta got a little furious and angry, thinking about how her father was very clingy and sometimes strange because he said wonderful things. She decided to push him away from her and say that it hurt her to hug, which made the Duke a little confused, looking the girl in the eyes and apologizing for everything, because he was just showing her his strong love. Looking sweetly at the girl, the golden-haired aristocrat promised that from now on he would protect her as his personal knight, because she was now a member of the Lindhagen family and would remain with him forever. However, when Dad was paying full attention to his daughter, admiring her, hugging her, and saying sweet things, Ricardo stood quietly to the side and watched his father, who probably never behaved like that with him. Raising his hand to his chin, the boy said with a smart look that of course he apologized for his words, but still wanted to tell his father that Greta would not be with him all his life, because she would get married in the future. Hearing this, the Duke was so horrified as if it was the biggest shock in his life, which is why he looked in shock at the boy with the blue head, because he does not want to let Greta go. He sadly lowered his head, which caused a blue cloud of sadness to appear above him, which made the blonde look at her father in confusion and not know how to cheer him up. However, the man's sadness quickly disappeared when he imagined the beautiful Greta behind him and said that he would then make his daughter the official heir to his title and all his wealth. Ricardo was truly surprised, since almost all aristocrats do not do this, but he was even more outraged that the Duke was now going to give his entire inheritance to his daughter, and not to him, the son who lived with him. The Duke liked the idea so much that he enthusiastically placed his hand on his chest, and with his face flushed with delight, said that if Greta inherited his title, they would always be together, and he would stop being sad. The aristocrat continued to kneel in front of the protagonist, who was sitting on the bed, promising her that she would definitely become a duchess. But it seemed that from the main character's stiffness, one could understand that she did not really want this. And when the girl continued to look uncertainly at her father, who was telling her that now she would have to learn manners and dancing and music with knowledge of etiquette, Ricardo stood sadly behind them, as if no one needed him, He turned away with displeasure and a sullen face, because the father's great attention to his daughter began to confuse and even irritate him, because he had only known her for a day and was already getting closer to her than to him for the rest of his life. Ricardo could only look sadly at the aristocrat smiling at the girl and telling her everything, also promising that if she asked him for anything, he would certainly do it. Imagining the main character in a blue dress and on a golden throne, the man said that she would have all the toys in the world, all the jewelry, and the best of everything, because she would become a duchess. Putting his hands on the lady's shoulders with a smile, Greta's dad once again said that he would fulfill any of her wishes with joy, because he wanted to make her happy. But while the father and daughter were chatting sweetly, Ricardo, it seemed, could no longer listen to their conversation, because he headed towards the door to leave the bedroom unnoticed by everyone and go away. Being completely alone, the boy walked along the blue, slightly dark corridor even without an escort, but he didn't need one, because he seemed to want to be alone with his feelings. Soon Ricardo came to his office, where he saw a pile of books on the table, because all this time he had been studying hard in order to be a real aristocrat. And he also studied the history of the Lindhagen family, respecting it. He was so enraged by the very books that had made him want to delve into the family history that he wanted to sweep them all off the table with his own hand, doing it quickly and furiously. After that, he remained standing in the office alone, looking at the table and the mess on the floor, muttering through his teeth that his father had returned his real daughter. His eyes, even burned with anger, were bright as the sun, while he, restraining his rage, looked down and said, even if the girl inherited the title, he would never give up. And while Ricardo was sorting out his feelings, Duke Vikram was happy with the new news in his life. The main character was already in bed, while the maid Loria was next to her, saying that now it would be better for her to get some sleep. After this, the maid left the room, and the protagonist was left completely alone in a dark bedroom with a light interior, where only her rustling and breathing could be heard, echoing throughout the large room. However, she didn't plan to fall asleep because suddenly she got out of bed with a serious face, because she realized that while she was alone, she needed to quickly think through everything, because she realized that she had been reborn into a game. Getting out of bed, she walked over to the desk and was about to sit down on a chair, looking at the open notebook, next to which was a pen for writing notes. But these items would only help the girl think. Taking a pen in her hand to write, the girl looked at the notebook with a smile on her face and said that now she needed to think through a plan for the future, taking into account that she knew the expected development of events and characters. The first thing the protagonist remembered was a TV with the name of the game she was reborn into, realizing that the events begin with the debut of the princess heroine when she turns 18. Also remembering in my head important characters, more precisely, men with white and brown hair, the girl realized that in order to complete the game, you need to interact with them and marry successfully. When the conversation turned to candidates for husbands, the girl remembered Ricardo, who had grown up but was still serious and had a sword in his hand, realizing that in the game he was a good option for marriage. Looking at something with a thoughtful look and hiding a pen in her hand, the girl realized that although her dad had not told her that Ricardo was not his blood son, she herself knew this very well from the game. Having imagined the events in the original, the girl realized that she was unlucky to be born a villain who would humiliate the princess and bring her to her knees, laughing at her only because the heroine was getting close to her half-brother, which made her jealous. The blonde in the game did not hesitate to openly laugh at the heroine of the story, pulling her by her long hair and continuing to mock her, because jealousy has taken over her heart and she intends to harm her rival. The protagonist remembers very well how in the game Greta laughed so sincerely and loudly at the suffering of the princess that no one had any doubts that she was truly evil, possessing no bright feelings. Also, according to the plot, Duke Vikram soon sided with the crown's opponents, which is why Greta mocked Ricardo as he turned away from them and left, because he did not support them. While writing something on paper, the white-haired girl understood that Greta soon wanted to kill Ricardo because he did not take her side. But in the end, the villain herself lost her life because her brother plunged a sword into her stomach. The girl drew herself and the princess with a crown in ink and also drew an arrow between them, thus creating a diagram about how they would meet at 18, and moreover, they were the same age. The serious lady continued to look at her drawing and remember in her head that there were still 6 years before the events of the game, and this time needed to be used as effectively as possible, so as not to end up in the events of the original. After drawing the princess with the flag next to her, Greta crossed out both figures, telling herself that she should not only distance herself as much as possible from the original plot, but also avoid meeting the heroine and all dangerous characters, like red flags. After that, the girl fell onto the bed and began to look at the ceiling, telling herself that for now this is all she can think of for herself, because there are many adventures with obstacles waiting for her time. Turning on her side, the girl began to think that the only correct plan was to escape from this house as soon as possible. But she did not believe that a former slave like her could survive alone. Moreover, the main character remembered those moments when her dad hugged her tightly, sincerely and truly, which even surprised her. But because of this, the lady understands that she does not even have a great desire to run away because of parental warmth. But as soon as she fell asleep, she was no longer in bed, where she had been sleeping peacefully, but was running through the night forest so quickly, as if she was running away from someone, wearing a red dress and high-heeled shoes. Sighing nervously, she overcame every obstacle in her path and did not even look back, running away from someone with as much speed as her strength would allow, because the girl would soon get tired quickly and would not be able to run from something. She ran away from Ricardo, who appears behind her with a long sword and a pale face, looking at the girl with an evil look, because he is the lady's main nightmare, from which everything around becomes even darker. Like a demon, he cast a look at Greta that seemed to want to harm her, causing everything around to turn red and scarlet. But he only asked the girl where she intended to run. But the main character didn't plan to stop and answer Ricardo, so she continued to run away. But she was unlucky, because her legs quickly got tangled and she fell to the ground, cursing her inattention. As soon as she raised her head, the one who was about to take her life appeared right next to her, stamped his foot on the ground, causing the blonde to raise her head to him in alarm. And when the main character ended up right under Ricardo's feet, when he mercilessly pointed the tip of his sword at her, intending to turn the cute girl in a pink dress into just a lifeless body, because he hates her with all his soul, Greta, whose face was already scratched from the clumsy fall, looked away in shock and seemed to call out to her father, hoping that he would come here and protect her no matter what. But her hopes were false. It would be useless for the girl to shout to others and call for help, because Ricardo did not hesitate, but immediately swung his long sword at the heroine with a furious face, intending to take her life. And exactly at this moment, the girl suddenly woke up, opened her eyes so wide as if she had truly experienced fear for her life in a realistic dream. But in reality, there is also a fear that Ricardo will kill her. She was still alone in the dark room with the blue light from the moon, so she looked at the ceiling, reassuring herself that it was just a dream and nothing more. But she still got up from the bed with an indignant face, asking herself why Ricardo decided to kill her in such a cruel way, which even scared her in her nightmares. The girl gradually became integrated into life and forced herself not to think about the bad, coming up with more and more new ideas to protect herself. And therefore, in the morning, she, together with Ricardo and Dad, was already sitting at the table and silently having breakfast. Duke Vikram silently watched his daughter even when he was not talking to her, because she filled all his thoughts, which is why he just wanted to admire her. He looked at the girl, who was eating bread and soup for breakfast in a cute pink dress, and didn't even pay attention to him. But Dad thought that his daughter didn't even know that she would soon be dancing with joy from his gift. The whole point is that the father is going to give his daughter a big blue teddy bear with cute eyes, which he imagined behind him, confidently thinking that Greta would be incredibly happy with him. He even imagined in his head that Greta was looking at him with happy, childish eyes, holding a blue teddy bear in her hands and enthusiastically thanking her dad for such a wonderful gift. Even thinking about this made the Duke blush and smile sweetly, which made Ricardo and Greta look at him suspiciously and surprised, although they continued to eat, not understanding what was happening to their dad. Then the main character realized that now was the best time to talk to her dad, and so she looked at him confidently, telling him that she had an important request for him. The Duke was so happy about this that his face turned even redder. He was truly happy and smiled, because he was really looking forward to helping the girl with something and getting closer to her, fulfilling her wish. He even raised his index finger, solemnly telling his daughter that she didn't even need to cook anything, because he had already prepared something for her that would make her incredibly happy. But the girl still interrupted him, getting ready to ask for something. Greta placed her hand on her cleavage, frowned, looked at her dad, and said that she really wanted to learn how to fence with swords, to master the art of fighting with cold weapons. Hearing this, the Duke was literally speechless, looking at his daughter with a face numb from shock and an open mouth, because he did not even imagine that the sweet lady would ask him for this. He realized that at that moment, all his sweet dreams about Greta's joy from the bear had shattered into small pieces, just like the image of an innocent beauty in the head of the aristocrat Vikram himself. And while the confused father, his head blue with shame, asked the girl what to do with the bear, the girl was confident in herself, because she understood that if she learned to hold a sword in her hands, it would not be easy to kill her. But after some time, when Dad finally fulfilled the main character's request, she was already in a place bright with beautiful architecture, where there was a beautiful staircase, columns, and a gorgeous garden. Ricardo and Greta were also there, because the boy taught the lady fencing, but she was never able to do anything, because her opponent effortlessly made the heroine's sword fall to the ground and slip out of her hands. Ricardo made her blow so professional and strong that the main character's palms began to hurt a lot. Her fingers gradually turned red, and she looked at them with irritation, amazed at the young man's skill. But that was not all, because Ricardo handed the protagonist the tip of a wooden sword for training so deftly and quickly that Greta was surprised by this, freezing and realizing that she had lost in an instructive fight. In his serious eyes, Greta already saw that stern guy who in the future would not be afraid to stick a sword into her stomach, because even now Ricardo shows his fortitude and confidence with skill in front of an ordinary lady. The girl looked at him in confusion and no longer raised her hand, because she did not understand why her death flag was so close and pointing a wooden sword at her, as if they were already real rivals to each other. But before all these events, when the girl did not yet know what she would have to go through, she looked at her dad with confidence while he asked his daughter if she could repeat what she had just asked him. Then Greta resolutely placed her fist on her chest for the second time and told her father that she wanted to learn to fence as soon as possible. Ricardo was also surprised by this, who strangely took a shit on the heroine with such a face, as if he also did not understand anything, and wanted to hear an explanation from the lady or quickly object to her. Gesturing with his hand towards the young beauty, the boy said with displeasure that he would always protect her from everything, and that this was quite enough for safety. Therefore, he did not see any benefit in the girl's desire. But the girl said again that she didn't want anyone to protect her and be around her 24/7, which is why Ricardo continued to look at her with bewilderment, asking if she trusted him. The children's father was watching this as his daughter talked to Ricardo and came up with new arguments about how she needed to learn everything herself. But the Duke was also listening, understanding that his daughter's desire was interesting. Then the aristocrat began to think, putting his hand on the table and telling the main character that he was very interested to know what she would ask him for. First of all, he assumed that there would be either toys or dresses with decorations. Then he smiled, his cheeks turning pink as he said that he never thought she would ever ask him to teach her fencing, as if she were a knight and not a sweet and defenseless girl who was only interested in shiny charms. After this, the father put his hand on the girl's head and said with a smile that she was still his daughter and therefore he had no right to refuse her. He was going to fulfill even such an interesting wish. And as soon as her father said that he would definitely teach her to fight with swords, the girl instantly became happy, not believing that her father had agreed to this, but still blushing with admiration. But when Greta, with a smile on her face, thanked her dad for his help, Ricardo suddenly stood up from his seat because he hit the table with his palm in anger. Jumping up from his seat, the guy put his hand on his chest, intending to loudly and sincerely say that he was against his decision and did not want his sister to learn martial arts, as if it affected his feelings as her only guard. In response, the little girl also stood up from her chair, slammed her hands on the table, began to look at Ricardo with anger and say that he had misunderstood everything, but they were both interrupted by Vikram, who was already about to say something. The father looked at his son and daughter with delight and love, telling them that in that case, if Greta wanted to learn fencing, Ricardo would teach her personally, which is what he now ordered the boy to do. Ricardo was so shocked that he opened his mouth not to speak, but just like that, because his jaw dropped down on its own when the protesting guy only made things worse for himself with his dissatisfaction. But the satisfied Duke only wrung his hands and continued to be amazed, saying that he had no need to worry, because he had previously personally taught Ricardo to wield a sword, and therefore his skills should be passed on to Greta. The children could only look at the couple with emotions of defeat and shock, silently listening to his words about how they would have fun together, usefully, if Greta really wanted to learn what Ricardo could do. Duke Vikram even put his elbows on the table and enthusiastically said that for them this was not only a fun time, but also a great opportunity to get closer, because he noticed how little they talked. Thus, the girl, who had never held even a wooden sword in her hands, found herself on the street among flowers and architecture, wearing boots and red leggings in which she practiced fencing. She looked at Ricardo with a face blue with astonishment, and understood that when he directed the end of the blade towards her face, she did not feel a grain of that closeness that her father had spoken of earlier with a smile. Ricardo and Greta had no idea that the Duke had been watching him all this time, and he was very interested in seeing the children's activities, so he looked with interest at how the heroine, who had lost to her brother, looked at the wooden sword. Dad was holding a blue teddy bear that he had planned to give to Greta, but he was not discouraged by the fact that everything had not gone according to plan, because he was watching his son and daughter with delight, saying out loud that it seemed like they were getting along and were friends. He was happy and began to talk to the one he saw in front of him, and it was a bear, which he turned towards his face, asking the bear if he thought so about it, and if it wasn't wonderful that his two children had started to be friends. The bear was unable to answer the Grand Duke, but even if he really wanted to do so, he would not have succeeded, because he was not alive and his mouth was sewn from blue threads. But the father of the son and daughter still hugged the toy tightly, sadly saying that he would definitely give it to Greta one day. But the bear's face did not change, as if he would say that he did not plan to be sad at all. Vikram continued to treat the bear as if he was his third child, talking to him and comforting him, causing the passing maids to glance at him and think that their aristocrat had become an amazing person. However, when the Duke was talking to his new friend and the maids were rushing to do their work, Ricardo suddenly turned away from his rival and said that there was no point in them continuing, which made Greta very indignant. And when the heroine shouted at Ricardo to wait, he only turned to her with displeasure and explained that she was very weak, and there was no point in them even moving forward if she couldn't even handle the training. After that, he left, holding a wooden sword in his hand and not even turning to Greta, telling her to give up this idea, because then it would be a good decision. The main character realized that she needed to be much more persistent and confident with Bart, which is why she once again firmly took the sword in her hands and stood in a stance, asking her brother to repeat the fight, which is why Ricardo turned around. The girl was so confident that she continued to look at Ricardo as if she didn't believe his words about weakness, because she was asking him to fight her again. But when the boy with the dark earrings began to look at the girl, he unexpectedly said the word 100, which caused the blonde to sit down on him with incomprehension and withdrawal, still holding the sword in her hands. And when the guy clarified that he meant 100 push-ups, 100 squats, and a sword swing, doing it every day without stopping, the main character became indignant at her teacher, shocked and asking why everything had to be repeated so many times. But Ricardo wasn't going to explain anything to the heroine because he just turned around and left, saying that if she couldn't handle it, there would be no more business and he wouldn't teach her. As a result, the main character was left completely alone among the fir trees and beautiful arches of the castle, watching as her mentor actually leaves and does not even look at her, which surprises her very much. And no matter how hard and sad it was for her, she still wasn't going to give up, because she immediately began doing push-ups from the ground, telling herself that 100 push-ups wasn't as impossible as she thought. However, as soon as she got down to work, her arms, which did not have much strength, weakened, causing the girl to fall to the ground, making an unpleasant squeal. And when the protagonist realized that although she had good muscles in her past life, now, because she ate little, they were very weak, she remembered how Ricardo turned to her, telling her that she should give up. She began to look at her hands in shock and realized that the problem was not in her skills but in her strength, which she really lacked, and which is why Ricardo gave her such big tasks for physical training. Once the girl realized that she needed to train harder in order to at least resist her brother in battle, Greta began to confidently swing her sword with a serious face, telling herself that Ricardo could not be disappointed. But she didn't even think that at that time her dad was looking at her sadly, who had been behind a tree not far from her the whole time, sadly watching how his beloved daughter was trying her best to please her brother. And when the sunset was already decorating the garden in the palace, the red rays of the sun fell on the girl. She still continued to swing her sword, saying out loud that this was her 99th swing and then the final one. Sweat was running down the heroine's face as her trembling hand continued to hold the sword tightly, not letting go of it even when it seemed that all the training for today had come to an end. Greta wanted to continue swinging her sword further, but she was unable to do so because her father approached her and addressed her by name, causing the girl with the ponytail to glare at him. But the man only told her not to overexert herself. Greta just smiled at this, telling her dad that she wasn't tired at all. But from her sweaty face and shortness of breath, one could already tell that she had been training for a very long time, if not the whole day. And when the girl, with the same smile, told her father that he could go into the house and not worry about her so much, Duke Vikram did not listen to her, but extended his hand to the girl's wrist, Turning the girl's palm towards himself, the father saw calluses on the fragile girl's palm, which had formed because the heroine had been continuously holding a wooden sword in her hands throughout the day, waving it. For a second, she had doubts about whether she should continue further, because she had been training for a really long time. But she immediately changed her mind, pulling her hand back and telling her father that she was not finished yet. What surprised the girl even more was that her dad didn't say anything else, but only took her hand again to smear the calluses with healing cream, while Greta looked at him with a longing expression. After her dad told her with a smile that this ointment would help her get rid of annoying calluses faster, the girl looked at her palm with embarrassment, blushing from her dad's concern. The girl, who was burning like fire with the desire to quickly start practicing even harder, which surprised her father, did not notice how Ricardo was looking at her from a distance, perfectly understanding that Greta was not going to give up. He didn't say a word, just casting a thoughtful glance towards his father and sister, as if he was slightly surprised by Greta's efforts, but also now saw in her the person who seriously wanted to learn fencing. The pair trained together every day for a month. One of those days, Ricardo stood in front of Greta as usual, who had already learned to fend off enemy attacks and hold a weapon in her hand, albeit not a real one. But no matter how diligent the girl was, she still understood that in front of her now stood not just Ricardo, but a talent that would never give in to her, trying to show a real professional sword fight. And the main character was not going to give up, even though she understood that she was fighting against a master in her field. So she caught her breath with her head down before starting an attack against her brother. At that moment, Ricardo mistakenly thought that his sister was probably tired if she was shrinking and couldn't get enough air, and that's why he looked at her even with regret, because he thought the girl's gaze was very tired. Having looked closely at the girl's birthmark on her body, the guy thought that Noah had certainly inherited from her father the ability to wield a sword perfectly, because noble blood flows in her, unlike him. And when Ricardo got angry because of the thoughts about this girl having everything he could only dream of in his life, he noticed in front of him that Greta was already running at him not only with confidence, but also with a sword over her head. The tip of her sword's blade was so close to Ricardo's face that the guy was surprised to think that he would already lose. But it slipped just a millimeter away from him, making it clear that the girl was serious. Then he decided to finally see in the girl his rival, his sworn enemy, before whom he angrily clenched his teeth, fighting off the attack with all his might and preparing to respond to Greta with an even greater blow. And Ricardo's attack stunned the heroine so much that she instantly leaned back with amazement on her face and managed to dodge, but it cost her precious balance. The girl clearly felt like she was about to fall headfirst onto the stone road, but she couldn't do anything, because her attempt to resist Ricardo had resulted in her losing because of her clumsiness. And even Ricardo himself realized what he had done when he allowed his anger towards the innocent lady to come out, looking at the falling girl with incredible fear that paralyzed him, forcing him to no longer move. He looked at Greta, stunned, who had been conscious and competing with him a couple of minutes ago. But now, having hit her head on the stone road, she still hadn't gotten up, which made the whole atmosphere around her become gloomy. The passing maids immediately ran up to the unconscious girl, looking at her and trying to bring her to her senses. But Greta did not respond to them, and Ricardo, devastated by grief, looked at this picture. Still holding the sword in his hand, he could do nothing because the fear was so great that he froze in place like a statue, while his shocked, piercing gaze looked only at Greta's body. All the worst memories from the past instantly surfaced, causing Ricardo to remember how his stepmother beat him, slapping her across the cheek while he sat in front of her and was helpless. He also remembered her furious face, full of hatred, because she pointed her finger at Ricardo and screamed that he was a real demon, who did not deserve love and was brought up in the most disgusting way. Ricardo began to tremble like a puppy, trying to touch his face and understand what was happening. But he himself clearly realized that the nightmares from the past had not gone away and were now haunting him, appearing at the most terrible moments. One of the maids noticed the guy's inaction and therefore turned to him, calling him by name. But Ricardo in the blue suit still felt enormous guilt for what he had done. Sadness. But the main character never found out about all this, because she woke up already in her room, from which she stood up, looking at the interior and not understanding what happened to her after losing consciousness and how much time had passed. Turning her head to the side and looking at someone, the heroine who had just woken up, realized that she was not alone in the bedroom, because a joyful maid was already hurrying to her, happy that she had woken up. Loria hugged Greta very tightly and said that he was incredibly glad that she had finally woken up, because everyone was worried about her. But the blonde only accepted the hugs with shock, as something unusual that she was not used to. When the hug ended and the maid told her that she had slept for 2 days, the fair-haired girl thought with her eyes closed, realizing that she was already tired, and her brother's blow only finished her off. The maid became serious when Greta started talking about training again even after waking up, touching her arm muscles and saying that she would train even harder now. But the girl became more serious because she looked at Loria, who was telling her about Ricardo. That is, she was telling her that he was now feeling very bad because of what happened. The thing is, right now, the boy was sitting alone in a simple room that looked like an attic because it had a strange wooden ceiling, simple things, and just a desk near the window. Ricardo himself sat on the roof and bowed his head down because he felt incredibly bad. In his head, he still had the distinct voice of his mother, who said that he was a real demon. And so Ricardo even said out loud that he was a real monster, looking sadly at his feet and adding to his words that this was his place, where there was no one and he could not harm anyone. The maid told Greta all this, saying that Ricardo was now in the attic, not eating anything and not even showing up, while the main character looked at her in surprise, Selling sitting in bed. Loria also told the girl that when she fainted, he called himself a demon and ran away in fear. And the protagonist was even more surprised by this, asking why he calls himself a demon. The heroine thought seriously, even looking at the maid with a suspicious, wary look, remembering that in the original story there was no such thing. And she also asked Loria how her father was. And as soon as the maid said that the Duke had been urgently summoned to the palace and that because he had not appeared for a long time, Ricardo might suffer, Greta looked in amazement at the maid, who took her hands and began to beg her to talk to her brother. And while the main character was about to appear before Ricardo, the guy himself remembered his childhood, namely his mother, with whom he often walked and strolled around the village, talking cheerfully and holding wheat in his hand. The kind and generous mother loved her son very much, which is why she gently stroked his head, which little Ricardo liked very much and which made him laugh. But not everything in his days was so good, because suddenly fate took everything away from the boy, even his own mother, who could not escape the fire that one terrible day completely consumed their house, turning it into ashes. Immediately after this, a certain gentleman came to the orphaned boy, introducing himself as a servant of Count Saynar, and he came here to take him to their palace. So completely alone and poor, Ricardo found himself in a luxurious room, when behind him he saw a high and beautiful aristocratic door, which only shows the high status of the family and the house he entered. At that moment, the boy saw his stepmother, who was still looking at him with a smile and welcoming him into her home, because she is a respected lady in high society, although no one knows her real face. As it turned out, the boy was brought to this house because his mother had worked as a maid in their house for a long time, and soon she had an affair with Count Sainara, which is why Ricardo was born. There was a problem in the family. Or rather, the couple had not had a child for a long time, and so they decided to take Ricardo, gradually teaching him everything at the table, while the stepmother was nearby, still kind and affectionate with her adopted son. However, the boy's happiness did not last long, because the couple could soon have a child, whom they often held in their arms out of happiness, because now he was their biological son. But for little Ricardo, this meant that he was just playing the role of some son in the family, feeling truly lonely. Someone who is constantly experiencing someone else's life and cannot find a place for himself. And it was with these thoughts that the guy appeared near the newborn child of an aristocratic couple. Or rather, his shadow fell on the baby's body while the baby was sleeping soundly and did not suspect that someone was looking at him. Ricardo, who was carefully creeping up to the baby's crib, did not seem to express any emotions, but continued to look at the child as if he felt something special for him. Certainly not indifference. And the son of Count Saynar continued to sleep, while Ricardo's shadow next to him grew larger and more ominous, as if the boy did not intend to leave everything so simply, and therefore entered the room of the baby, precious to the aristocrats. The boy's hand reached out to the sleeping baby, vulnerable to any danger, without any obstacles. However, Ricardo did not plan anything bad against the son of his stepmother and father, because he gently stroked the boy on the head when he was sleeping and when the guy was watching him and seemed to be touched by his appearance. His cheeks even turned red when he looked at his brother and thought that he looked very cute and even like an angel, because he was as sincerely glad about his appearance as he was that he was lucky enough to live in this house. But that evening, the boy was not destined to simply stroke his brother and admire him, because when he turned his head, He was surprised to notice his stepmother nearby, who was already clutching her head in horror. She watched with indescribable fear on her face, which was slightly feigned, as Ricardo's hand simply extended to her son. But only this made the woman's face turn blue from the nightmare that the boy was about to kill the baby. The mother was shaking with horror and fear for her son, covering her mouth in shock when a smiling Ricardo approached her and with joy in his eyes explained that he just wanted to see his dear brother and stroke him, touch his head. And Ricardo thought so for the reason that until now in his head he had imagined a happy family where there was a stepmother, he, his father, and his brother, whom he joyfully holds in his arms and where everyone was happy. But these were just dreams. All the boy's hopes for a happy life were dashed when he received a strong slap in the face from his mother, whom he had previously respected and loved. But now she only proves to him that he is not a full-fledged member of the family in the house. And while Ricardo didn't even believe what had happened, his mother furiously screamed at him, saying that he had tried to kill her child, for which he could not be forgiven, because he was a real demon, whom they had taken as a son in vain. Soon, the mother pushed the defenseless and uncomprehending Ricardo to the floor, while his face was getting redder and redder from the powerful slap. But he only wanted to explain to the woman that he had no intention of harming his brother. But when the woman heard what seemed to be someone coming towards them, she quickly grabbed her son Luke into her arms, smiling and comforting him as the baby began to cry due to the noise. And while the mother was talking to her child in her arms, telling him that he was the kindest and best boy in the world, Ricardo approached her fearfully, holding out his hand to his mother and trying to say that she had misunderstood everything. However, the aristocrat only looked angrily at Ricardo and said that she no longer wanted to see him around, and that she was not even his mother from that moment on, telling the guy that now he had neither a mother nor a stepmother. And when Ricardo didn't even have time to tell the whole truth, guards immediately appeared behind him and grabbed him, while his stepmother ordered him to be immediately locked in the attic, because he was a demon in the flesh. Thus, for the first time, the boy found himself locked in the cold and dusty dungeon for something he had not even committed. But he still had hope that he would be released, and so he knocked on the door, calling for help. Tears were already welling up on his face, and he was ready to tell everything and even more, which is why he was telling someone that he was not guilty at all, that he was not a demon. But no one listened to him on the other side of the door. That is why now the boy preferred to lock himself in the attic on his own, sitting on the bed and sadly realizing that for his terrible act, because of which the heroine lost consciousness, he would definitely be kicked out of the house, as happened in the past. But the boy had no idea that on the other side of the door was already the main character with golden hair, who intended to talk to her brother very seriously, convince him and calm him down, something that even the boy in the attic had not dreamed of. However, Greta herself was not completely sure of her actions, because she looked at the door for a long time and wondered whether she would provoke her so-called death flag, whether she would awaken in him a sudden desire to kill her. The girl herself did not notice how she said her thoughts out loud, and therefore she was horrified when Ricardo responded to her, asking if she was standing there behind the door. And Ricardo found himself closer to the door, wanting to talk sadly with the girl. And so the first thing he said was that he was very glad that she was okay and had woken up. Putting her hand on her chest from pleasant emotions, the girl smiled and told her brother that she really felt good, also asking why he didn't get out of here if everything was already fine. But when the girl heard Ricardo say that he didn't even plan to approach her after what happened, because he really liked her and he apologized to her for everything, Greta seriously thought better of it. For 1 second, she imagined herself happy and smiling, breaking through a wooden board in honor of the fact that she could easily get rid of the attention of the main killer according to the plot. However, at that very moment, she became even more serious and realized that she would not leave it all alone. So she kicked the door hard and shouted that she was not happy with this, which surprised Ricardo. She, shouting that they should continue fencing, also calling Ricardo the death flag, tugged at the door handle and tried to open it with all her might, with such fury as if she was angry at the guy. And when Greta screamed that she would never allow her death flag to be on its own, Ricardo even moved away from the door and began to look at her in complete shock, not understanding what flags his distraught sister was talking to him about. The little girl managed to open the locked door, which she swung open without much difficulty, looking only at Ricardo and warning him that she was breaking into his attic no matter what. However, Greta's clumsiness once again forced her to create the unexpected, which is what happened now. Because having tripped, the girl collided directly with Ricardo, who was no less surprised than she was. She didn't say anything, but simply froze in place, gradually blushing, but mentally thanking Ricardo for being in the right place, because from another fall, she didn't want to fall asleep again. The awkward situation passed quickly, serving only as an awkward moment because the white-haired girl was attracted by the door, which slammed shut, thus locking them in the room, while Lay pulled the handle and realized that she had broken it. Then she looked at Ricardo in confusion, her gaze telling and showing the whole deplorable situation, which made the guy sigh and look away, realizing that with the same force with which she opened the door, Greta closed it not well, but tightly. After some time, the servants in the palace realized where the children were and therefore gathered near the attic door, talking about something and only making sure that the door really did not open even with male strength. The butler shouted to the children that he was very far away, but the castle was very badly damaged due to some big blow, and hearing this, the blonde became embarrassed, asking the servants how this was possible until Ricardo died. The servants told Ricardo and Greta that they would call a locksmith and so they would leave. And so soon the couple found themselves alone, locked in the attic, both of them looking hopefully at the seemingly glued door. They didn't know what else to do together, so they remained awkwardly silent while Ricardo scratched his head in embarrassment and looked at the floor, and the girl was embarrassed only by his presence. Greta was terrified of being alone with her main killer in the game's plot, which made her afraid to even look at Ricardo, who was sitting down on the bed, devastated. It was as if something was grieving him and he was going to talk to the girl about it if he had such a wonderful opportunity, because he sighed and told Greta that they needed to talk about something important right away. Raising his head to the girl and looking at her, the guy said that they were different in blood, because he was not her blood, and he did not even have a birthmark in the shape of a rose, which she and her father had. Imagining himself sitting in his head while the tall Duke Vikram leaned over and extended his hand, Ricardo explained that he had been brought to this house only to be raised as an heir. Greta looked in surprise at the guy who, even more saddened, began to truthfully tell the girl that now, since the real child of the aristocrat was found, meaning her, she would be the only heir to the title and wealth. He hung his head in devastation and despair, telling the girl that he had no choice now because his blood would be driven out into the streets and he would be deprived of everything because he dared to harm his sister. But Greta only confidently approached the guy and, putting her hands on his waist, said that she did not want to become the heiress, realizing that Ricardo only had a serious injury if he called himself a demon. Ricardo was not at all excited to hear this from an innocent girl at first glance, who seemed to understand nothing about adult matters. But in front of him, she was very confident in her words, which made the boy believe her. Greta was confident in herself, and therefore, pointing to herself with her hand, she sentenced herself to live her life the way she wanted, to create her own destiny. She even turned around and confessed to Ricardo that she was thinking of leaving this place, which surprised the guy even more, looking at her with wide eyes and asking if she was telling the truth. Indifferently waving her hand, she walked away from Ricardo. The girl said that if he didn't know, then in her past life she was a slave, and therefore it wouldn't be difficult for her to find work. Stretching as if from a long sleep, the girl with long hair said that everyone here was very nice and charming, but the life of a lady was not for her, because she was not accustomed to luxury and manners. And when the girl fell silent, wondering whether Ricardo believed her words, the guy suddenly said that she would not be able to carry out all these plans. Ricardo explained that her father would never let her go, because he loved her with all his heart, which is why the lady imagined Duke Vikram above her, who constantly calls him, worries about where she is. And while Ricardo looked at the lady thinking about something, Greta already understood that she needed to act in such a way that her father would not interfere with her and would not interfere with her life and destiny. However, the girl was able to come up with a plan to solve this problem so quickly that she confidently pointed her finger at the surprised Ricardo and said that she had already come up with an idea on how to drive her dad crazy. And while the boy looked in shock at the charismatic girl who was smiling at him and pointing her finger at his face, a plan was already forming in the head of the delighted Greta, which she intended to tell Ricardo. After some time, when the girl told him her plan on how to get rid of her father's attention, the guy only spoke with his head down, saying that he was not at all sure that everything would go as smoothly as she said. But the girl was very indignant at the guy's words, suddenly approaching him and saying that now was not the time to doubt, and she needed clear answers, or rather, his acceptance or refusal to participate. The blue-eyed blonde began to look Ricardo in the eye with an intent and angrily, admitting that he simply had to help her, because it would be good for both her and him if he wanted to stay with his dad. But the guy was in no hurry to answer her, because he blushed deeply, looking in shock at the girl whom he initially disliked, but now blushed at every word and action of hers. He turned away from the main character in embarrassment, stuttering with a red face and telling Greta that he would help her. And the girl responded with a smile and words of gratitude, calling Ricardo her brother. However, Ricardo looked seriously at the girl when she decided to ask him if he really had not accidentally wanted to deliver that very blow in the duel, because of which she lost consciousness, tragically falling to the ground. The guy shamefully recalled in his head that very moment when his rival scolded her for not being able to keep her balance even if she dodged his sword, and this memory was very painful for Ricardo. The uncertain boy said that he had not meant to hurt her at all, and that he did not understand what had come over him, so he said it very shamefully, as if he could never forgive himself for hurting the little girl. However, he turned his head to his friend when she said that he was not at all to blame for this, since she was the one who attacked him first and he was not a demon, as he had loudly spoken about himself earlier. Gesturing with her index finger and looking at Ricardo with a stern gaze, the girl said that no one was offended by him, and everyone was very worried about his health, which is why they wanted him to come out of the attic. And when Greta once again said that he was not a demon, Ricardo was so surprised by this, as if he had not expected to hear this from the person whom he had harmed and made lose consciousness. And while the children were in the attic, sorting things out and calming themselves down, Duke Vikram was in an incredibly tall and luxurious palace, like a royal one, because the highest aristocrats had called him there on an important matter. The white-haired Duke found himself kneeling right in front of the king, who sat majestically on his throne and looked at his guest before saying something. The king had green eyes and already gray hair. It was clear from him that he had been sitting on the throne and ruling the kingdom for quite a long time. But when Duke Vikram asked why he called him here, King Zeras replied that there was one matter concerning his daughter. King Zeras said that he was very well acquainted with the son of a certain great Duke of Sharma, imagining him with white hair and in a white suit, as if he were the same aristocrat who had a special status among noble society. And when Zeras said that he was planning to set his daughter up with this white-haired young man from another ducal family, Vikram's face turned blue from surprise. He was categorically against this idea and such an early marriage. Despite this, Duke Vikram continued to kneel before the king and through clenched teeth asked him how this was possible, to which the man on the throne replied that thanks to this marriage, he would only strengthen his ties. Imagining not only a luxurious and vast palace, but also imagining banknotes falling from the sky, the king explained that the Sharma duchy was so great that it was called the second royal family. But Vikram only frowned even more, getting angry, realizing that the king only wanted to use his daughter as a tool, and so he told him that there was no need for that. The duke even raised his head to the king and asked very confidently, if the influence of the Sharma duchy was so important to them, why didn't they betroth their son to Princess Marielle, meaning the king's daughter? Hearing this, the king was incredibly surprised because he considered Duke Virkram's words to be very impudent and unanswerable. So he looked at him with wide eyes, clearly not knowing what to answer next. Vikram continued to kneel, saying that he understood his reaction perfectly well because there were very dark rumors about that child. But he also could not marry off his only daughter, especially by force. Imagining in his mind the son of Duke Sharma named Joel, who could supposedly pierce anyone with his violet eyes, Vikram said that there was a rumor that at 12 years old he was as cunning as a snake. The duke said that the moment he finally got his daughter back and became her father, he wanted him to be the one to find a worthy groom for her, loving and noble. But when the king heard this, he was surprised, saying where else he could find a better groom than Joel. The king even began to mock Vikram, pointing his finger at him and smilingly asking if he really wanted to use his adopted son named Ricardo, who was as dirty as a pig and ignoble, for this. But when the king dared to speak about the rumors that it was Ricardo who had tried to kill his newborn son, his own son, in the past, Vikram, in anger, hit the floor with such force that Zeres fell silent. Vikram looked furiously at the king and did not hesitate to shout at him at the top of his lungs that Ricardo was not like that at all, and all the rumors were a complete lie to tarnish his ideal, bright reputation. Zeres never said anything because she looked at Duke Vikram with great fear, as if he had not expected his guest to react so angrily and suddenly to his ridicule of Ricardo, who usually forgave him for everything. After this, the duke rose to his feet and harshly attacked the king, saying that if he wanted to talk about the rumors, he should know that Ricardo would never raise his hand against his brother, and no one even wanted to listen to him. Vikram didn't want to talk to the king about anything anymore, and so he quickly turned around and walked away, saying that their conversation was over. But Zeres clearly didn't expect this, anxiously telling him to stop and listen to him. But the father never planned to turn around to the man who did not see happiness in his children. So he calmly walked down the corridor with light decorative elements, where there were white columns and red chairs. He was not destined to walk down the corridor alone because the butler came running to him in a hurry, saying that there was important news, while an angry and dissatisfied Vikram was angry at the king and his words. Duke Vikram stopped, looking at the butler and asking if he had anything serious to say, to which he replied that he had just received some very important news straight from his mansion. But as soon as the butler started talking about Ricardo with Greta, the Duke's face immediately tensed up, as if he was experiencing incredible excitement and shock for the children, intending to immediately go to them. Meanwhile, the children continued to be locked in the attic. Greta was lying on the bed, and Ricardo was sitting next to her, because they both did not even notice that they fell asleep, discussing their plan for the girl to escape from home. However, Greta immediately jumped out of bed and looked towards the door with horrified eyes, because she heard a loud noise in the corridor, which also woke up Ricardo, who had previously fallen into a deep sleep. But when the two children heard their father's voice on the other side of the door calling them by name, they quickly jumped up from their seats and intended to go to the door, calling their father to them and asking if it was really him. There was a great deal of noise in the attic because Duke Vikram had the courage to kick the door down with such force that it fell to the floor and began to smoke, while the Duke, who had just arrived from the royal palace, was looking at it. Greta and Ricardo looked at their father with great shock and surprise, not even knowing what to do, because the entire staff and they themselves could not open the door for several hours, and their father did it in 1 minute. Ricardo immediately closed his eyes because he was already accustomed to the fact that they were ready to beat him and scold him for any mistake or misunderstanding. And in the case of harm to Greta, he was even ready for the fact that his father would hate him. The worried father quickly approached his son and daughter, hugging them and with red cheeks hugging them very tightly, confessing that he was very worried, so he put aside all his business and came to them. The one who was most surprised by his father's affection was Ricardo, who felt his father's tender embrace and was very surprised by it, because he still thinks that he does not deserve it, because he is a demon who is waiting for his father's punishment. The father told Greta that he had galloped to them on horseback when he first learned about what had happened, also asking how the girl was doing now, because he knew that she had been ill before, to which the heroine replied that everything was fine now. And then Vikram turned to Ricardo, saying that he would now tell him everything about Greta's injury. And at that moment, the boy looked at him with such fear, as if an adult was about to scold him and he would face great fear. He once again lowered his head in shame because he was afraid to even look in his father's direction, stumbling and trying to say that everything happened by accident. But he didn't mind being punished, because it was because of him that Greta fainted. But Vikras didn't even scold the boy or reprimand him because he just put his hand on Ricardo's shoulder and said that the main thing was that he and both of them were okay. And when the guy wanted to say that it was he who created all the problems, Vikram interrupted him again with a smile and replied that he was as dear to him as Greta. But the guy suddenly shouted that his father was lying. Sadly and angrily lowering his head, the upset boy said that he didn't even have a birthmark on his neck, and he could never become a real heir, which is why he loved him less. Vikram was very surprised by Ricardo's words, as if he never thought that the guy would think about such a thing and worry about it, because from his face it was clear that this was a real shock for him. Recalling in his mind the very moment when they first met, the Duke said that all the time they spent together, he was very pleased to have a son like him. Also recalling how he taught him sword fighting, Vikram said that since he had lost his daughter and wife, he needed Ricardo's company, so he loved him very much, like a real son, his own. Vikram remembers very well how they sat together at the table and ate, but even in those moments he loved Ricardo very much and wanted to continue to take care of him, because he saw him not as an ordinary heir, but as a close person. The Duke very often praised Ricardo and stroked his head when he told him his successes in shock and showed him books, telling him what new he had learned today with such a happy face that he himself did not notice it. Taking the boy by the hands, the father said to him with a smile that he was very sorry that he had not said something earlier. But now, taking advantage of the moment, he wanted to tell him something important. Ricardo's eyes filled with tears when his father told him that he loved him not for his birthmark, but because he was a very dear person to him, a precious son, whom he was also afraid of losing and would cherish, just like Greta. The girl with golden hair looked at them with a smile as Papa continued to talk to Ricardo and explain that they would discuss the issue of an heir a little later, in a calm environment. Judging by the little girl's smile, she was glad that her father did not scold her brother, And she was also happy because, in fact, there was no difference between her and Ricardo, and her father loved them equally. But just when she thought that everything was fine, strange hallucinations appeared in her head, where she runs up to her father, tells him that Ricardo pushed her, and points to her brother, who is shocked by her actions. However, the girl looked at her brother with such an ominous smile, as if he already knew that now Ricardo would be very bad, because the little girl complained to her father about him, and now enjoys the fact that someone will suffer. At that moment, everything around Ricardo became very dark and empty, when he himself looked at the girl with such round eyes, as if he was incredibly afraid that now his dad would violate him and humiliate him, because of which he would believe that he was a demon. Strange hallucinations filled the girl's head, which is why she even covered her mouth, so as not to say such disgusting things that would have happened in reality if she had a nasty character. Greta was glad that she was still in the attic and saw her happy mother and brother in front of her, but she covered her mouth because she understood that these events, on the contrary, happened in the plot of the game. The girl blushed a little, still looking at her father with Ricardo, realizing that fortunately she had the power to change her fate, and therefore she would not behave as terribly as she had earlier in the game's plot. After this, the girl and her father found themselves in another room, when Vikram escorted the beauty to the room and said that they were all probably very hungry, and therefore he offered them breakfast. But if she was in no hurry to answer anything, because in the middle of the room she noticed her brother, who was just standing and looking at her, which is why she understood little. But the boy continued to remain silent. Looking at the boy strangely, Greta just looked at him and waited for something to happen, and then the boy said that he just wanted to thank her for everything she had done for him over the years. Greta was very surprised by Ricardo's words, as if she did not understand what he was saying and also speaking about it, like she had not done anything special yet for him to thank her for something so seriously and truthfully. However, when the boy suddenly reminded her that it was she who broke the lock, which is why they were locked in, the girl was surprised by Ricardo's behavior, became wary because she had no idea what he meant, and why he was behaving so strangely. Ricardo sighed, but the girl continued to look at him, considering the guy's behavior strange, but she didn't even think that Ricardo intended to laugh at her, all reminding her of the funny situation with the attic. Right after that, Ricardo smiled so sweetly and sincerely, as if the whole situation with the attic and the closed door only made him laugh, which is why he now smiles sweetly, a little embarrassed to show the girl his joy. Greta just looked sweetly at Ricardo, who said that all Lindhagens were truly crazy if she could slam a door with all her might, and another could knock it down with one blow. She just gestured with her hands and smiled, saying that for this very reason they couldn't do without him, a man who could make normal decisions with a cool mind and not give in to emotions. And through the windows, they both heard the voice of their father, who was calling the children to go to breakfast quickly. The girl with golden hair extended her hand to the guy, asking if they would go to his place together. This moment was not just ordinary for Ricardo, because in the face, in the eyes, and in the behavior of the little girl, he saw his father, who is also very kind and sincere, understanding. Then, without further ado and with a sweet smile, he extended his hand to the girl, because he realized that he trusted her as much as he trusted his father from the moment she told him her intentions and attitude towards the future. After some time, the couple had breakfast with their father, and they both decided to act because they appeared before Vikram, stating that Greta really wanted to become the head, the heir, because of which Dad looked at them seriously. Herta was also serious, telling her father that they had made a decision together and that therefore she would be the main one, the Duchess and the true heir to the Lindhagen family wealth. Ricardo continued to stand next to her and say that he was just going to help his sister in something, while Greta was already smiling at him, revealing a little of their plan. But Vikram remained serious. At that moment, Greta remembered how they had rehearsed this very moment a couple of hours ago with these very words, reading them out on pieces of paper, already preparing to show her father a performance, saying that they had decided to make Greta the heir to the family. But now they needed to show all their seriousness so that the father would believe them, and he really looked at the children without a smile, asking Ricardo if he was sure about this, to which the boy sadly replied that he agreed to everything. However, before all this could happen, the couple were sitting on the bed while they were still locked in the attic, as Greta told Ricardo her plan to drive her dad crazy and how she should leave their house. The girl imagined herself as a real lady in a green dress, saying that according to their plan, she would portray herself as a diligent girl who liked everything and who was learning manners and etiquette. After this, the girl imagined herself with luggage in her hands, leaving the Lindhagen's house with a smirk, sticking out her tongue because now she was ready to calmly leave the place she didn't like, which Ricardo would take. And when the girl was confident in her plans, telling Ricardo that if he planned everything well, she would be able to run very far away, the boy only asked her where exactly she was going to go. Imagine yourself in country clothes with a cow and a house. The girl said that she would save money for a house in the forest, where she would live her whole life. And while Ricardo looked at her as if he didn't believe that she would live alone and in peace, the girl was thinking about how to develop an escape plan if it would be very difficult for her to cope with everything alone. Ricardo looked at Greta with wide eyes, trying to tell her that if she did this, her father would be very angry. But this did not bother the heroine, because she intended to find an accomplice in the form of Ricardo himself. Again gesturing with her finger as if she knew everything in advance, the clever lady looked at Ricardo and said that this would be a great moment for Ricardo too, because he would be able to take the leading position in the Lindhagen family. And remembering all this, the girl with blue eyes looked at her thinking father, mentally thanking him for all the help, but in her head warning him that she wanted to be as far away from death as possible, and therefore was leaving them all. That's why the girl smiled, looking towards Ricardo while Vikram himself thought for a long time about the children's decision, and also involuntarily shook, as if he was experiencing deeper emotions than it seemed at first glance. The thing is that Duke Vikram was already crying for something, sitting calmly in his place. As soon as the children saw this, Ricardo and Greta were very surprised, opening their mouths in front of their dad, with amazement on their faces, not understanding why their dad suddenly decided to cry, as if they had said something sad. And while Duke Vikram wiped tears from his eyes and asked Ricardo and Greta for forgiveness for this, the boy and the girl were clearly worried, asking what had happened to him. But after he failed to wipe the tears from his eyes, he blushed, telling the children that he was very happy with the thought that their family would not be separated, but on the contrary, would become stronger. Although in fact, Greta had completely different plans for the future. Just as suddenly as he had started crying, Vikram stood up from his seat and placed his hands on the table, solemnly saying that if they had already decided everything, then they needed to start preparing right away. Clenching his hand into a fist, the blonde joyfully said that he would have to find the best teacher for the future head of the family, if it was Greta, his beloved daughter, for whom he was ready to do anything. Greta could only hesitantly feign confidence while Ricardo looked at her and noticed that now the girl would not only have to proudly tell her father that she wanted something, but also prove it with actions and teachings. In the meantime, the Duke and his children had only good news, which he was incredibly happy about. In a dark alley where there was no longer any luxurious architecture, but only devastation with rotting roofs and buildings. Under one of the houses, there were two people, one of whom was wearing a hidden dark cloak, who asked an ordinary villager how he could sell that very girl to the Duke. The one who had previously been the main character's master when she was still a slave only grinned, telling the unknown person that he had sold that girl to some Duke, and he would never have thought in his life that that poor girl was the daughter of an aristocrat. But when the unknown person told the boy that the story of that unfortunate girl could be falsified, the villager, who had many slaves, looked at his interlocutor with surprise, asking if he wanted to buy his silence. But the stranger was not just a man who was interested in a beautiful slave, but was the same servant who got rid of Greta on the very day she was born. And now she only smiles, saying that she still knows how to make her be a simple beggar. She remembered that very moment when she laughed at the newborn girl with blonde hair, realizing that she had never been able to get money and status, and therefore she was not going to let Greta live happily. And even now she laughs out loud, saying that Greta is never destined to live happily and that she is contributing to her grief. The two of them were not destined to devise a devious plan to harm Greta, because suddenly that stranger in the cloak appeared, holding a knife with a bloody blade in his hand and saying that they were just small fry. The fact is that right under his feet, the maid who had kidnapped Greta and deprived her of her family was already lying dead on the ground, where the slave master who had previously humiliated the girl and not given her freedom was also located. And while the unknown person was taking the lives of others and getting rid of unnecessary problems, the main character herself was already beginning to study hard, which is why not only books on various topics appeared in her life, but also etiquette, which told her about the rules of tea drinking, conversations, and even horse riding. But she also did not leave her studies in Ehtavagyu, because once again she was in her usual place for this. But she was on her knees because once again she fell, dropped the sword from her hands due to failure. She continued to kneel in front of Ricardo and did not get up while he looked at her, and admitted that he noticed how her movements slowed down and she became less agile. And when the guy explained that she was taking on too much, which was why she was tired, the girl just stood up and said that this was not true at all, and that she had a great desire to learn. As she remembered that wielding a sword would save her from many death flags, she not only struck a pose, but also raised her wooden sword, looking at Ricardo and preparing to continue her training. Ricardo could not refuse the girl, and because he looked at her only with slight surprise, because he does not often see someone who is ready to study so hard, especially from girls who usually prefer to talk and gossip. That's how things went in the Lindhagen family. And sometime after the children were engaged in martial arts, Ricardo was already in his father's office and sitting on the sofa, looking at papers, while his father was looking at something out the window. Even though he was busy with something, he still thought about Greta, namely whether she would be able to withstand such difficult training and whether everything would be okay with her. But the father also behaved very strangely, because he only looked out the window and said nothing, clearly thinking about something and sighing when there was barely noticeable blush on his face. Ricardo even turned away, noticing the Pope's strange behavior and not understanding what was wrong with him. But at that moment, the Duke turned to him and addressed him by name, as if he wanted to tell him something. The guy immediately jumped up from the sofa, looked at his father, and asked what was the matter, abandoning the previous lesson. But Vikram only said that he wanted to talk to him because he wanted to hear important advice on the matter. Vikram sat down at his place, the desk, continuing to sigh and act ambiguously as Ricardo came closer to him and asked what he meant. But the white-haired aristocrat with blue eyes only looked up at his son and asked if he knew what Greta really wanted, because it was incredibly important for him to hear it now. It seemed the boy was expecting a more serious question from an adult who not only couldn't find peace over such a trifle, but also sighed as if it were a big problem for him. The Duke explained that he had no idea what the girl wanted, and that was why he thought she wanted dresses, shoes, or jewelry, which he already gave her every day. But the calm Ricardo was surprised and inspired when his father said that he was saying this because the little lady had a birthday soon, and it was incredibly important for him to make her happy. The two men continued to stand there, thinking about Greta's gift, but Ricardo was sadly thinking about the fact that his sister had been kidnapped right on her birthday, and that this holiday should have been the first good day in her life. Vikram said sadly that he was sure that his daughter would not like another teddy bear, because she was already 13 years old, and giving jewelry and dresses was very boring. But Ricardo only smiled at this, realizing that today he had to ask his sister what she wanted. At this time, the girl herself, it seemed, did not think about the upcoming holiday, because she walked angrily along the corridor and thought about everything that she should learn as an aristocrat, doing it so strangely that the maid turned to her. Greta was angry that she had to learn everything that was required, and that was a lot of work, which now only made her irritated, walking down the hallway with a dissatisfied face. When the girl was thinking that she needed all this in order to avoid the death flags, one of them suddenly appeared right in front of her, putting his hands on her shoulders and thus saving her from falling, because the girl was walking tired. The boy with golden eyes said that he caught her like a fish, once again realizing that he found her in time and saved her from falling. But for Greta, this closeness was too frank, which is why she pushed him away from her with her hands, smiling and asking if he was okay, as if he was the one who suffered. And not hearing an answer from her brother, she walked down the corridor again as if nothing had happened, telling Ricardo that she was just thinking. The girl thanked her brother for his help, but Ricardo had no plans to let her go, which is why he grabbed her hand, causing the main character to be very surprised and stop. Looking at the girl, Ricardo said that they needed to move away, intending to ask the main character about what she wanted for her birthday. But for Greta, all the guy's behavior already looked strange, so she was surprised when she looked at her brother. But she could no longer turn around and go anywhere if her brother wanted to talk to her. As a result, the couple went to the garden, passing by beautiful snow-white columns and architecture. But the girl still asked Ricardo what exactly he needs, but only to pull her hand. Ricardo chose a very cozy and somewhat romantic place for the conversation, namely the garden, where in addition to well-groomed trees, a fence, and bushes, there was a snow-white fountain, causing clear water to bubble. Noticing an empty bench near the fence, Ricardo took his sister by the shoulders and made her sit down, as if he no longer wanted her to leave him and listen attentively, which interested the girl a little. The slightly indignant lady turned to Ricardo and said that she had another lesson to which she already needed to hurry. But her brother only sat down on the bench next to her and sighed, saying that everything was fine and she shouldn't worry. But when Ricardo said that she was already being scolded every day for being late, the girl was very surprised and indignant, opening her mouth and looking at her brother as if she definitely did not expect such words from him. It was as if Ricardo just wanted to talk to the girl, So he calmly told her that being late again wouldn't change anything, and also said about himself that he loved to come here and enjoy nature. But Greta silently looked at him and didn't understand what he was getting at. Looking carefully at the one who sat in front of her with his eyes closed and simply enjoying the wind, the sun, and the murmur of the water, the girl remembered that her brother had also taken the air's lessons and therefore had introduced the habit of relaxing here. She imagined for a moment that she too could allow herself to relax in such a magical place, and so she also closed her eyes and began to enjoy nature, not noticing that their palms were lightly touching. But after some time, when the main character accidentally fell asleep and did not even notice how evening had come, she jumped up from the bench and grabbed her head, not knowing what to do, while Ricardo sat and said that, unlike her, he did not fall asleep. And when the girl asked him why he hadn't tried to wake her up all this time, the guy said that he had been doing just that all the time, pushing her by the shoulder and shouting her name, but even then she didn't wake up. Greta blushed and looked at Ricardo in shock when he extended his hand to her and said that while in her sleep she had not wanted to let go of his hand, which had surprised and puzzled him. Then the sad main character turned around and actually walked back, saying that she absolutely had to apologize to the teacher for being late again. But Ricardo also stood up and asked if she could wait. But when Ricardo almost told Greta that he needed to know what she wanted from her father for her birthday, he immediately shut his mouth, remembering that her father had forbidden him to give him away. But Greta still turned to him and asked what was wrong. Greta kept looking at the boy very strangely when he simply said that they both needed to assume that he wanted something, and he wanted to know what it was. But the girl said that she didn't understand anything. Ricardo even began to sweat with anxiety, explaining that her father was always giving her something, but he would like to know what exactly she wanted. But the lady still asked what had come over him. Having imagined luxurious dresses, jewelry, and gifts in her head, the girl thought about Ricardo's words seriously, remembering that her dad had really given her a lot of things, but she didn't know yet what exactly she wanted. But the answer came to the girl by itself when she remembered her dad's kindest and happiest smile when he gave her gifts, presenting them so joyfully, as if it was him who was being given something, and not he to someone else. Ricardo noticed that his sister suddenly became silent and thoughtful, which is why he asked the girl what was wrong with her, carefully looking at her emotions. Greta never answered the guy directly because she blushed, charismatically raising her finger to her lips and smilingly telling her brother that what she really wanted was a very big secret. Ricardo blushed just as much, looking at his sister with genuine shock, not understanding what Greta meant and what she had come up with if he had said directly that he wanted to know what she really wanted. But the main character didn't plan to explain anything to Ricardo, because she turned abruptly and ran away from him, saying that she needed to meet the teacher immediately, and she would talk to him later, which is why she left her brother alone with a shocked face. This is exactly what Ricardo told her father, who was sitting at his desk with dark circles under his eyes, wearily asking his son what secret Greta had told him and how he understood what she wanted. Ricardo was just there and told her that it was quite normal for girls her age to behave so strangely, but Duke Vikram kept saying that it was not like that at all, and he had to find out her wishes. Looking away with his eyes tired from guessing, the aristocrat repeated again that he would definitely pass this test if Greta decided to play games with him. A few days later, the main character's birthday arrived, which is why she was dressed in a beautiful dress in white and purple. And there was also a blindfold on her eyes so that the birthday girl would not see all the surprises at once. It was clear from her that she was nervous, did not understand anything, frowning and sweating, because she did not even know what to expect from her family members, who had definitely prepared something amazing for her. Ricardo, who was also dressed in an elegant dark suit for the holiday, took the girl by the hand and began to lead her somewhere, which made the main character even more worried, asking her brother where he was taking her and what was happening. The thing is that a couple of hours ago, Loria woke her up from her bed, immediately showed her the dresses and said that she needed to get dressed immediately because something amazing was already waiting for her, while Greta herself was rubbing her eyes from sleep. But now the slightly frightened girl is afraid that Ricardo will take advantage of her vulnerable position and try to kill her, for example by pushing her off a cliff, because he is the main flag of death, which she must guard against and not trust him. As soon as she opened her eyes, having removed the blindfold before, the girl realized that no one was going to harm her, but on the contrary, her relatives had prepared a surprise for her, because Vikram was smiling, congratulating the girl and pointing with his hand to the table with gifts in the distance. And on the table, there were not only bouquets of flowers with gifts in white boxes, but also a large strawberry cake with cream. behind which there were other gifts with dark ribbons packed in boxes. The girl even raised her hand to her mouth in surprise, because her jaw had dropped open in shock. She kept asking Ricardo if all this was just for her birthday, to which the guy replied with convenience that everything was as she said. The surprises for Greta were not over yet, so Dad came up to her with a blue teddy bear and handed it to her, once again congratulating her on her birthday, while the main character was still in shock, which is why he looked at the toy with his mouth slightly open. The girl looked at the blue bear, holding it in her hands and watching its sweet smile, blue eyes, and big bow, wondering if this was her gift, because she had never even celebrated her birthday before. Vikram sheepishly said that he didn't know if his 13-year-old daughter would want a teddy bear, but they both looked cute now, so he thought a soft toy might make her happy. But Greta didn't say anything, because she suddenly blushed, turned her head to the side in embarrassment, because tears of happiness quickly appeared in her eyes as she continued to hold the bear in her hands. Then she smiled sweetly at her dad, realizing that she had never had such a holiday, thanking everyone for the gifts and attention with a sincerity that could touch anyone. As soon as Vikram saw the happy emotions of the main heroine, he himself began to cry, looking at the girl and saying her name while the children were looking at him with shock, especially Ricardo, who did not expect that tears would be shed at the celebration. Wiping away tears, the father told the children that he would really like not only him to see all this, but also his late wife, who would certainly be happy to see her husband with his beloved daughter and son. Soon he smiled, explaining that they would not be sad and cry at the party, and therefore he wanted to give the girl the rest of the gifts that had been prepared for her in advance. Vikram did it anyway, presenting his beloved daughter with her most gifts in a box with a smile, which made Greta with a stunned expression not even know what to do with them, since they didn't fit even in her small hands. He also gave his gifts to Greta and Ricardo, telling her about the expensive and beautiful flowers that he ordered especially for her, because they are as rare and elegant as the birthday girl herself, according to him. At that time, Vikram silently watched his son and daughter talking sweetly to each other, the girl sweetly holding a large bouquet of roses in her hands and laughing at Ricardo's words, while he himself watched her and was only happy to see her smile. In his thoughts, the aristocrat imagined his late wife next to him, who was also happy with her children, smiling at them, which made Greta happy. But these were just Vikram's dreams. And when the satisfied Greta was already unpacking her gifts, which contained beautiful jewelry, Ricardo came up to her and whispered, asking if they had guessed right with the gifts for her and if she liked everything. The girl thought, turning her head towards her father, who was sitting at the table at that time and looking at her with a smile, not even suspecting that Greta did not want material wealth, but something that could not be bought with money. She confidently approached her dad and extended her arms to him, thereby offering him a hug, as if this would be the most precious gift for her. She also looked away shyly and said that she needed to be hugged, already waiting for her dad to give her his warm embrace. And when the main character began to think that she was talking nonsense in front of her dad because she was only 13 years old, she did not notice how Vikram got up from his chair and came up to her. He also picked up the girl in his arms and looked into her eyes, saying that if this is the request of his beloved daughter, he is ready to fulfill it, which is why the main character looked at him in shock. Hugging the girl tightly, Vikram himself blushed, saying that he was ready to hug her all his life if she wanted it, and hugging would make her happy. But Vikram was very surprised that Greta not only began to enjoy the warm embrace with her dad, but also kissed him on the cheek, which made the aristocrat instantly become more serious, feeling the kiss on his cheek with amazement. She was so unexpecting of a kiss from his beloved daughter that his face turned to stone with surprise and great defeat, because even the simple kindness of a girl always makes him happy, makes him smile. Having lowered the main character to the floor, he bent down slightly, still in shock and saying Greta's name as if she had just really stunned him. And even when the whole family gathered around the table to eat strawberry cake together, Vikram seemed to be in another universe, not believing that his own daughter had kissed him, giving him such a nice gift. And while Dad still couldn't believe his happiness, the children were talking among themselves. Or rather, the main character was asking her brother if he wanted to receive from her the same gift that she had just given to Dad, which surprised Ricardo. But Greta was more surprised because Ricardo told her that it was he who wanted to please her today, after which he broke a piece of strawberry cake with a fork and presented it to the heroine's mouth, telling her to open her mouth. Greta did so, tasting the cake and chewing on it, to which Ricardo said that she was a good girl, that today she could not be denied anything because it was her birthday, the moment when all her wishes should come true. The boy with a smile and a fork in his hand even said that this was his gift to her, because he also guessed that what was important to her was the love and support of her family, and not jewelry and dresses. Hearing this, the blonde with blue eyes instantly blushed and became embarrassed, which is why she covered her mouth with her hands, looking at the guy in shock. And when the surprised girl stood up and said that it was not fair, because an ordinary piece of cake cannot be considered a gift, Vikram noticed this perfectly, who immediately understood that his son had not pleased his daughter. He stood up from his seat and approached Ricardo with a dissatisfied, angry face, saying that he was obliged to perform 1,000 swings of the sword right now to atone for his guilt before the girl. Ricardo was calm, so he even looked at his displeased father with a smile, saying that he would do everything now. But Greta was more surprised by her father's words, telling him to wait before coming up with a punishment. And so the life of the sweet girl passed, because of which gradually more and more teddy bears of different colors appeared in her room, which her dad gave her for her birthday and which she put on the table in the bedroom. The girl had at least 4 teddy bears, which symbolized the 3 years that had passed in her life when she was able to get used to herself and become attached to her, while also learning aristocratic manners. The blonde with golden hair looked at the teddy bears with a smile, telling the maid Loria that this was already the 4th bear in her collection, to which the maid happily replied that it was. And when the maid told the girl that it was time for breakfast, Greta, who had grown older and only become prettier over the entire time, turned to her with a smile and said that she would now come to the family table. There was also a clear sky above the royal palace, which adorned the complex, majestic architecture of the castle, while something surprisingly dark was happening inside it, because the princess had also become quite an adult. The girl with brown hair opened the windows of her bedroom, wanting to greedily inhale the fresh air before starting to act and meet adventures, obstacles, and people along the way. She looked at the view from the window with great enthusiasm and said that this world, which was created only for her, was so beautiful and wonderful that she was ready to show everyone herself and her beauty, thinking about it with a glimmer of joy in her eyes. Greta didn't even think about the fact that the game she was playing had already begun, because she had grown up, having reached the age of 17. But for now, she didn't think about it, calmly reading the book in silence. However, she turned her head to the window, looking at something and just remembering that next year she would already be facing difficulties, because she remembered very well what events would happen, thanks to the passage of the game. The girl imagined in her head not only Ricardo, but also other characters, realizing that at her debut, when she turns 18, she will meet the main favorites with whom she will interact. Greta also imagined herself in the most evil form that she remembered from their games, realizing that it was at the very first meeting that she would interfere with the princess by first spilling tea on her, doing this supposedly by accident, but on purpose. She thought about it, looking at something and remembering that in a year, according to the plot, she would receive an invitation to that very tea party where all the characters would meet. But even now, she had not figured out how to escape from the palace. And while the girl was thinking about how she needed to find another partner in 1 year for a successful escape, she had no idea that at that time her father was reading a certain letter with a very gloomy face. He disliked the letter so much that he decided not to keep it or throw it away, but to burn it with a candle flame, which gradually turned the piece of paper into ashes, useless to anyone, which is what Vikram thought about this letter. After that, he hit the tom with great displeasure and asked someone out loud why the unknown person in the letter was asking his permission to get engaged to his daughter, since Greta was only his. In front of the gentleman was Loria, who was holding a tray with other letters in her hands. But she smiled at the aristocrat when he said that he was not surprised by such letters, because his daughter was truly beautiful. When Vikram finished talking about his beloved daughter, Loria told the gentleman that besides the letter he had burned with restrained anger, there were many other letters that definitely needed to be answered. But as soon as Vikram saw them and realized that these were all letters to him asking for his permission to meet with the beautiful Greta, Vikram jumped up from his chair and ordered the maid to burn them immediately. And now Loria was telling all this to the blonde, also informing her that this happens all the time and she even wants to talk about it with the gentleman, which surprised Greta, saying that her father really takes great care of her. Greta even recalled the most ordinary meetings, where she calmly drank tea, but was always alone, because guys were constantly following her and looking at her, because in fact they were surprised by the girl's beauty. She calmly sat down on the bed, saying in a goni nochnaya voice that this could cause some problems for them because something needed to be done about it, meaning not the attention of the guys, but the guardianship of her dad, because of whom she couldn't even go outside. But Loria, who was thinking only about the love of the main character, quickly blushed, asking if she liked someone, to which Greta replied that she wanted to get married, but she didn't see any candidates for husbands yet. As soon as the maid asked what kind of husband Greta wanted, the heroine began to tell that she dreamed of a calm, reliable, slightly shy man who would be a good swordsman. Hearing this, Loria was noticeably surprised, put her hand to her cheek, and told the main character that she seemed to know such a person, the one and only, who perfectly fits this description. And by her words, Loria meant Ricardo, who perfectly suited Greta's requirements, was handsome and talented, graceful in soul, an excellent swordsman, and a simple but at the same time aristocratic man. As soon as the maid embarrassed the main character, Greta turned away from her with displeasure, saying that this was all wrong and that they should stop talking about it. But Loria only smiled. Loria even laughed as she told the interested Greta that, to tell the truth, Ricardo had actually become a little kinder lately, especially when the main character was around. The girl's words puzzled the main character, which is why she looked at Loria skeptically, as if she did not believe her words. The evening quickly came, and for the main character, this day was another time to study something, which is why she was in a dark library where there was not a single soul. But despite the darkness, the two teenagers were still sitting at the table, where one lamp was shining and where they were learning something, looking at the table with fleeting conversations, as if Ricardo was teaching Greta and dedicating her to an important topic. The girl held a pen in her hand and wrote something on paper when Ricardo ordered her to rewrite the name of one of her relatives from the Lindhagen family, because she had put it down without hesitation, and it was necessary for her to know her ancestors. But Greta still couldn't get into the mood for studying, because next to her was someone who fascinated her with his beauty and the light of the lamp. And she saw in Ricardo not just a boy, but an attractive young man. Imagining Ricardo with a sword in his hands, the girl remembered that people recognized his talent and therefore her brother would soon join the knightly order. And in the future, she would pass on the title of owner of the house to him. Imagining herself with books in her hands and in a green dress, the girl thought that now everyone sees her as the heir to the title and thinking, but in fact, it is very difficult for her to learn to be a true aristocrat. That's why she often studies with her brother additionally, doing it at night in the library, but now she looks only at him, and not at the sheets of paper, because she considers Ricardo handsome. But at this time, Ricardo was very serious, telling his sister that even if she was very keen on fencing, she would need to delve deeper into her knowledge, because it would be useful to her. In response, the girl only sarcastically said that she would do so, showing the guy her playful smile, as if in fact she only wanted to make fun of him, because Ricardo had once again directly told her about her weak skills. Showing the guy her index finger, the girl said that if her brother meant her plan, then she wanted to say that everything was already under control, and in the future, she would definitely be able to earn money and escape from here. She even blushed a little, telling Ricardo with a sly smile that in the future, an ideal, calm life awaits her, a peaceful life without any problems and endless classes regarding aristocratic manners. And when the main character began to dream of a wonderful life, telling Ricardo that she would first sow a field and buy cattle, and then arrange a house, the guy only looked at her in silence. But when Ricardo asked the protagonist of the story in a calm and even slightly sad voice whether she was sad to leave here forever, Greta looked at her brother in bewilderment. Ricardo never answered the girl, as if he really wanted to hear the answer to this question, which worried him very much, made him not only sad, but also not look at the heroine, who seemed to offend him with words about leaving. And when the main character did not understand what had come over her brother, Ricardo just turned to her and said that there was a spot in the shape of a rose on her neck. Saying this suddenly and seemingly meaninglessly, Great still didn't understand Ricardo's intentions, but he didn't expect an answer from her, because the guy's hand reached for the girl's neckline to wave the light strands of hair from her shoulders and see the very spot he was talking about. After this, Ricardo asked Greta again if she really wanted to leave this house, coming so close to her that the heroine felt his warm breath and froze in surprise. However, what the guy wanted to do to Greta never happened, because he was very surprised when he heard Loria's voice in the corridor, who was calling Greta on important business, and did not suspect that she was now sitting in the library with her brother, in shock from his actions. And she continued to look in surprise at Ricardo, who at that time got up from his place and told the girl that their lesson was over, and that she could go to bed, since it was already late. There was a slight embarrassment on his face because the boy's cheeks were red, but he still did not hesitate to look at his sister and wish her good night, slightly saddened by the fact that he did not manage to get even 1 millimeter closer to her. Having said goodbye to the girl, the brunette, as if nothing had happened, left the library and walked past the surprised Loria, who immediately greeted him according to etiquette. And when the maid came to the library and saw Greta there alone, looking very strange, she asked if Ricardo had attacked her, which is what the maid imagined in her head, since the lady was so quiet now. Loria noticed that Greta did not want to answer her, because she was clearly experiencing very strange feelings that made her look down with a darkened head, thinking that she hoped at least that they had become a little friends. And while the main character felt something very strange in her soul that she could not even imagine before, Ricardo had already returned to his bedroom, dark and empty, where he opened the door, intending to be alone with his thoughts. He fell sadly onto the bed, as if he was dreaming of something. But there were no more aspirations or desires in his head, because his whole soul was filled only with thoughts of the blonde, whom he never managed to kiss. Only the memories of that moment when he was closest to her lips, when she froze, not understanding what he wanted, made Ricardo's heart beat faster, and worry only because of Greta. He covered his eyes with his hand in embarrassment because he blushed, doing it as if he didn't want to be seen so shy, and all because of the girl who made him think more and more about her departure with longing. That night, Ricardo was sure that he was an idiot for doing such a ridiculous thing to Greta, but the next day, the brother and sister were already called to their father's house to discuss something at the table. But when Vikram asked the children what happened last night, Greta could have choked on water from the awkward moment and shock. But Ricardo remained calm, only looking at the heroine's reaction. Vikram said that he was asking this question because in the morning when they first met at the table, they did not even look at each other, but only greeted each other as if they had quarreled. Ricardo, emotionlessly, which looked strange, answered his dad that everything was fine, to which Vikram replied that he was calm then. And the aristocrat also looked at Greta with a smile, telling her with some anticipation and intrigue that something had happened that they all did not expect. The children were very surprised and interested in their father's words. Ricardo said that what he was thinking about could really happen so soon, but Greta had no idea what her father was talking about, and he was clearly getting at something. However, when Dad told Greta that they had received an invitation to tea from the royal family, the heroine's soul seemed to sink into her heels. Her body froze and her face froze with an emotion of incredible surprise. But Ricardo seemed to notice his sister's surprise and therefore told her that the royal family uses tea drinking for the debut of aristocrats when they turn 18. That is, come of age. Remembering that it was at this tea party that, according to the plot, she was supposed to spill tea on the princess, which would cause her to get closer to her favorites, and thus the story would begin. And when the main character said that she was only 17 years old, Ricardo interrupted her, saying that this year she would already be 18 years old, and therefore she should also be present at the tea party. But the protagonist still remembered herself in the past, when she was making a plan to escape from the palace, realizing that she was wrong by 1 year, which is why she is now worried to the point of goosebumps. She doesn't know what to do because everything is sudden. And when she realized that at this rate she would be drawn into an original plot from which she would not be able to escape, her eyes instantly widened, her face turned pale from starch. The lady herself froze, because she understood that at this rate she would die a painful death. Out of fear, the heroine looked at her father and with her hand near her chest said that she did not want to go to the tea party. But Vikram replied that all aristocrats without exception would be at the tea party from the royal family. And when the aristocrat asked his daughter why she didn't want to go to tea, the girl, sitting at the table no longer so comfortably and boldly, became embarrassed, saying that there was no particular reason, although it was because she was incredibly afraid of the plot. Then Vikram put his hand on the girl's head, telling her not to worry, because they will always be with her and she has no need to be so nervous, because Ricardo, as a professional swordsman, will protect her, and he will deal with anyone who offends her. The girl just looked at her dad and was silent, feeling his hand on the top of her head and realizing that he still treated her like a child. So for her, escape would not just be difficult, but practically impossible. Imagining herself with the princess and Ricardo, the girl realized that, unlike the evil version of herself, she already gets along with her brother, and she is no longer the Greta who can humiliate others and spill tea on innocent people. We think that she is polite and kind, which made Greta believe that everything will be fine, and therefore she looked at her dad with a smile and said that in that case she would believe them and go to tea, although she is not sure. And after the blonde lowered her head and got dressed, Vikram began to happily say that in that case it was necessary to come up with a good dress, because he would be accompanying his daughter. But when breakfast was over and the girl found herself in her room, she sadly, as if hopelessly, laid her head on the table and thought that she had nowhere to go, because the game's plot would begin very soon. Then she stood up from her seat at the table, thinking that if the worst and most terrible thing she could imagine happened, she had already saved up a decent amount, thanks to which she would simply leave the palace. Having decided to look forward with confidence, the girl told herself that in that case she would run away not sometime, but right after tea, because now it was dangerous for her to remain inactive, still being in the palace next to her family. But in her head, the girl instantly imagined her brother and dad, asking herself what they would do after she left. If now they were smiling at her and sweetly inviting her to tea. And Vikram had no idea that the heroine was planning to run away. Thoughts about others made the main character anxiously turn her head. She wants to throw everything unnecessary out of her head and focus only on herself and the goal, quickly come up with a plan and not get involved in trouble. However, when the protagonist of the story already understood that she needed to run away from here as soon as possible, the one who had completely different plans for her looked at something with a sly smile and laughed. The white-haired aristocrat carefully admired the huge portrait of the main character, who turned out to be more beautiful than the sun or any star, and that is why the son of Duke Charm could not take his eyes off the lady. Touching Greta's portrait with his hand, the boy with purple eyes said with a smile that his beloved girl had overcome all difficulties, and therefore he was ready to make her his queen when they met at their first tea party. So one day passed before tea, full of excitement and worries, and the next day, over the palace of the Duchy of Lindhagen, there was a bright blue sky with small clouds, as if a solemn day full of adventures was about to arrive. Being near the very entrance to the house, because it was already time to go to the royal palace for tea, Vikram anxiously walks along the corridor, because he was waiting for his daughter, who was getting ready for too long. But as soon as he turned his head and looked at the man who came out to him, Greta's beauty seemed to blind him, because she was dressed in a beautiful red dress and she had dark gloves on her hands. When the main character noticed that her father had become suspiciously silent, just looking at her, the girl came closer to him and asked what was wrong. But Vikram only squeezed out a couple of letters from his mouth. And a second later, he raised his hand to his face and shouted to the servant to immediately call the artist, because such beauty as his daughter urgently needed to be painted on canvas as a masterpiece of art. While the main character was uncertain and did not understand whether her dad was joking or seriously wanted to invite an artist here, the father continued to praise his daughter, saying that she looked like a scarlet rose, beautiful and fresh. Vikram did not stop telling the heroine that they must definitely capture her image on canvas for future generations, and he could not believe that such a charming creature was his daughter. Vikram even started crying, wiping his tears with his hand and telling his daughter that he was happy, while Greta begged him to stop crying because they would soon have to appear in public. While Greta and Vikram were talking in the corridor and were already preparing to set off, Ricardo quietly approached them, holding his father's sword in his hands and therefore telling his dad to take it for himself. And when the children's father took into his hands his cold weapon, which he always carries with him on important trips, Ricardo clearly noticed that tears appeared in his father's eyes, although he himself was smiling and thanking him. The reason why Dad was crying was because on the day when he was supposed to be with the children at tea party, he had to be at the border on urgent business, which is why his son brought him the sword, which Vikram looked at with tears and sadness. The Duke cried and looked at the children as if he already missed them, while Ricardo reassured his father with words that he would accompany Greta everywhere and protect her. And the girl herself smiled, assuring him that everything would go well. But no matter how cheerful the girl was when she saw others, and especially her family, she still couldn't even smile, because the fear that she would again fall into the trap of the original plot was very great for her. She had nowhere to go, because no matter how much she wanted to go with her father, just to avoid appearing at the tea party, there were already a lot of aristocrats near the palace who were enjoying the holiday in nature. And among such noble people, the girl who had never appeared at such big events before, but was already able to charm everyone and attract attention with her golden hair alone, had already found a place for herself. Holding her brother's hand, the girl in a beautiful red dress, like wine, walked past the aristocrats and did not even look at them, showing her good manners and modesty in her behavior. But no matter how emotionless she seemed on the outside, Greta often hung her head in sadness because she understood that she already wanted to go home. But she would have to be among strangers and an uncomfortable atmosphere. Suddenly, she was brought back to her senses by her older brother, who leaned close to her, asking if everything was okay, which made the blonde surprised by Ricardo's behavior. She instantly turned away from him and covered him with her hand, because the guy said his words right next to him, which embarrassed the girl and made her blush like a strawberry. The couple continued walking, as Greta thought about why he was so close to her now. If earlier they were even embarrassed to talk to each other after the incident in the library. But she did not notice the looks of the guys who were not indifferent to her. Noticing the extra attention to his sister, Ricardo looked at the guys who were unfamiliar to him with angry contempt, as if asking what they wanted from his sister, whom he was protecting from people like them. The boys were very scared even by Ricardo's glance in their direction, and therefore were embarrassed to look at Greta, which is why the brother and sister were able to calmly pass by, but even then they did not want to leave them without a glance. Ricardo told Greta that they first needed to greet the members of the royal family, and so they began to walk between the aristocrats, looking at the people and finding among them the king, queen, and princess. The heroine's older brother decided to leave Greta alone and look for noble people in the area, telling her not to go anywhere, which made the heroine a little sad from loneliness. But she did not even suspect that the princess herself intended to approach her. The main character didn't even notice how the clever and cunning princess appeared in front of her with a glass of wine in her hands, not just to pass by, but to touch the protagonist's shoulder with bad intentions. As soon as she had done what she had planned, the princess herself screamed so loudly and pitifully, as if she had just been hit, which made Greta turn her head towards her and look into her eyes in fear, not understanding what had happened. The princess dropped her glass of light champagne and sat on the ground, looking pitifully at the heroine, because the entire drink had ruined her dress, appearing as a red stain on her yellow dress, as if Greta had pushed her. Other aristocrats and servants quickly ran to the princess, shouting her name and asking what happened, which made the brown-haired girl act even more pitiful, as if she was completely helpless. And when the princess, without a trace, confidently pointed her finger at the main character in the red dress, shouting that the girl in the bright dress dared to push her, Greta looked at her with such astonishment because the aristocrat was lying. The young man turned angrily towards Greta, angrily addressing her as you, and asking how she dared to push the princess herself, while the protagonist could not find words for justification and explanation, because she had not done it. She looked closely at the girl who was sitting on the ground near the fountain and could not get up, supposedly because she had been pushed, and while people were circling around her, wanting to help, Greta understood everything. Greta only needed to see the girl's face to understand that she was not a simpleton aristocracy, but the king's daughter, who is the beautiful main character in the game, with big blue eyes and chestnut hair. Only the face of the main character of the story made Greta remember the original events of the plot. That is, the moment when she poured wine on the princess, which caused her soft yellow dress to be ruined by large red stains. However, it was Greta who did this, because she was the villain who sought to humiliate the princess even in this way, looking at her and mocking her, as if her dress was too simple, and therefore she decided to decorate it. But now it was the other way around, because Greta looked in shock at the princess, who chose to spill drink on herself and pretend to be innocent, pointing her finger at the stunned heroine as the culprit. Turning around, the girl with golden hair realized that people had already begun to whisper about her, saying that she had committed an unforgivable act towards the princess, that she was ill-mannered and was a disgrace to the Lindhagen family. But while Greta was thinking about the situation and didn't even believe in it, a young man with violet eyes, interested in her, approached her and whispered that he was very sorry that she had to wait for him for so long. Without even realizing who was standing next to her and what aristocrat had deigned to talk to her, the girl looked at the son of Duke Charming in surprise and silence, and with her appearance showed that she was waiting for an explanation from him. Greta preferred to be as quiet as a mouse and not say anything unnecessary while an unknown blonde man, who only exuded evil and treachery, was looking at her. But he whispered to her that he would now resolve the whole situation with the princess. Having dared to look into the eyes of a guy unknown to her, the girl realized that she was seeing a very unusual guy in front of her, who was looking at her and was not shy about showing her his interest in her. Having called the main character his companion, an unknown blonde with violet eyes approached the princess and asked her forgiveness for Greta, saying that it was just an accident, albeit an unpleasant one. The handsome white-haired man even knelt down in front of the princess, holding out his hand to her and saying that his name was Joel and that he was ready to help her. But the girl herself, it seemed, did not want to receive help from him. The people around began to whisper when Joel approached the princess and extended his hand to her, saying that no one expected him to come here, because he is the eldest son of the famous and very rich Duke of Charming. They realized that Joel himself volunteered to help the princess, and this means that he needs something, because he is not an ordinary person who has a strong, dark aura with which he is able to capture all the attention around him. And while Joel was making excuses to the princess, saying that it was he who asked Greta to bring him a glass of drink, the stunned heroine stood behind him, her eyes wide and not understanding why the aristocrat was standing up for her. But Joel even put his hand on his chest, telling the lie with sincerity and regret, saying that Greta was in a hurry and accidentally spilled a drink on her dress, which made him very sad. The aristocrats watched with sighs and gasps as the handsome Joel told the princess that, as an apology, he would send her an equally luxurious and beautiful dress, but the girl was still dissatisfied. And while the princess looked at Joel with displeasure, as if she wanted to see Greta in front of her instead of him, the main character realized that she also needed to apologize, which is why she bowed to the princess, shouting that she was very sorry. While bowing to the princess, the heroine spoke with her eyes closed, saying that she had no desire to ruin her dress and that she was not going to harm her in any way. Greta even showed the princess her dress, telling her that if she wanted, she would clean her dress from stains, because in her head the girl understood perfectly well that if she did not apologize to her, everyone would think that she was rude. Even Joel and the princess were surprised by the words of the main character, not understanding what exactly she wanted to do. So they looked at her with wide eyes, as if they did not expect such behavior from the heroine. The aristocrats, who had been watching the incident very well and were surprised by Greta's bow, said that it was surprising. But the princess was not very pleased with the apology, as if she had expected something completely different. For a moment, she thought that things shouldn't be like this, but she still put on a happy face, smiling and telling the heroine that she shouldn't overwork herself so much. The girl also said that if she wanted her to forgive her so much, he would do it. But the princess's words only surprised the protagonist, which is why she looked at her with her mouth open. Calling her butler by the name of Fritz, the princess ordered him to follow her immediately, which the servant did, following the angry girl, who was left with a stain on her dress, a bad mood, and an unrealized plan. The princess left without even looking back, but the main character still followed her with an interested and surprised look, as if she had not expected their first meeting to go exactly like this. But while Greta was still reeling from what had happened, Joel approached her and asked if she would mind talking to him alone, looking into her eyes with a smile. Although, in fact, Greta was surprised by every event. In front of the girl, the stranger smiled sweetly at Greta and behaved like an aristocrat, but the girl already felt a strange aura from him, as if he was not at all what he wanted to appear at first glance. Even though Joel only caused negative emotions in the protagonist, she still sat down next to him on the bench, because she understands that the gentleman will not leave her alone, and maybe he wants to tell her something important. Greta stuttered as she tried to ask Joel something, like his name and what he wanted from her. But she couldn't get it out, causing her to just look at him shyly. But Joel was smiling and charismatic, telling the heroine that since he had not introduced himself, he would now do so, saying his name and introducing himself as the eldest son in the Sharma family. Joel said that he was very pleased to meet a young lady like her, and the shy girl answered him with the same words, actually thinking that things were bad, because this is the same villain according to the plot of the game. Remembering the portrait of Joel, the girl realized that he is not only the second villain for the princess, but is also the founder of the anti-royalty faction of those who are against the ideas of the king, and himself are his opponent. It was not for nothing that Greta remembered his role in the game, because it was he who began to manipulate her, forcing her to turn against the king in the same way that her father soon did, which led to the separation of the family from Ricardo. But Joel is also the fatal love of the evil Greta, who has always plotted the darkest plans against the princess with him. But for the heroine at the moment, the conclusion is that it is better not to get close to him. Remembering herself in the past, when she was just making her escape plan, drawing characters in a notebook and crossing them out, the girl realized that she shouldn't even have met him. But fate decided to do everything differently. The girl with a gloomy face even thought that in the game she met him completely wrong. But now Joel for some reason decided to show up for tea, and even more so to talk to her personally, as if Greta was his target. When the heroine realized that she needed to immediately run away from here and not get caught by the villains anymore, she got up from the bench and said that she needed to hurry, because the elder Borat was waiting for her, who was probably worried. However, she was unable to leave because she turned to Joel, who was leaning relaxedly against the back of the bench, and asked the heroine if she was uncomfortable with his presence. And when Greta, stumbling, wanted to tell the gentleman that this was not at all true, Joel simply stood in front of her, interrupting the girl and saying that this was not at all true, Standing in front of the girl, the guy with sly, purple eyes looked at the heroine with a smile and asked her why she decided to apologize to the princess, as if it interested him greatly. Greta couldn't find the words to describe her thoughts, but Joel didn't let her do it, because he put his hands on her shoulders and said that she didn't have to apologize to anyone, because she was the daughter of the Duke of Lindhagen. The protagonist anxiously asked the gentleman what he meant, but the guy only ominously whispered in her ear that if she took his side, she would no longer have to apologize to anyone. It was low and shameful. Joel did not hesitate to take a lock of the girl's golden hair in his hands and brought it to his lips to kiss, looking at Greta and promising her that if she was with him, she would never have any problems again. The charismatic guy looked only into Greta's eyes, luring her to him with a dark aura and begging her to choose only him, because together they will conquer the whole country. She will become his queen, and then they will live happily together. But Greta looked at Joel as if she saw a madman in front of her, who spoke only about his dreams and plans, but did not take into account her dreams, which were radically different. She was finally convinced that Joel had lost his mind when he leaned towards her to kiss her on the lips. But the girl was so surprised by this that she looked at him in shock, stepping back. The girl did not have to suffer for long from the annoying gentleman, who had already come to her aid by her older brother, who clearly saw next to her an unfamiliar man who was touching her shoulders. He glared at Joel and intended to protect his sister, while a drop of sweat was running down his face and he himself was greedily inhaling air, having previously run through all the soot, trying to find the missing Greta. Ricardo quickly stood between Greta and Joel like a wall, not letting the stranger pass and looking him straight in the eyes. But Lizzie was surprised only by the sudden appearance of her brother, which is why she looked at him with her mouth open. The stern and serious guy asked the blonde what he wanted from his sister, while Greta stood behind his broad back and listened to the cold conversation between the two guys. Ricardo said again that he was asking the stranger to move away from his sister, but Joel only said with a smile that at first he didn't understand who it was, and then he realized that in front of him was the son of the House of Lindhagen. The dark-haired guy kept looking at Joel with hostility as he laughed and said that even though he was his companion's brother, it was very impolite and uncultured to interfere in the couple's relationship. Also, before saying goodbye, Joel put his hand on Ricardo's shoulder and gently told him not to make a face, because he clearly had feelings for his sister, which had grown far into something more than love for a relative. After that, Joel smiled, pretending to Greta that he hadn't said anything special, but Ricardo remained serious, looking at his competitor menacingly, as if he wanted him to leave as soon as possible. And while the main character did not understand why the atmosphere between her brother and Joel was getting more and more heated, the white-haired aristocrat came closer to the girl and said her name, as if she also had something to say to him in the village. Surprised by every action, Greta silently felt how the tall aristocrat lowered his head to her to kiss her hair for the second time, hugging her neck as if they were already a couple. The girl quickly turned away from Joel with a red face, covering the top of her head with her hand, which the gentleman had just kissed, looking at the unfamiliar man as if he were a psychopath. Joel had done everything he wanted, and so he decided to leave Ricardo and Greta, waving goodbye to them and heading towards the garden, as if he would enjoy tea again if this time he had not managed to attract the attention of the beauty named Greta. Even then, Ricardo kept his eyes on Joel, notably watching the way the man he didn't like disappear from his sight when Greta stood next to him and seemed very embarrassed. The girl tilted her head forward because her face expressed genuine shock, because so many unexpected events had just happened to the heroine that she doubted her escape. And so the tea party with the aristocrats took place, which came to an end the next day, and therefore the main character was already near Ricardo in the carriage, asking her brother if he had forgotten something. Greta sternly told Ricardo that he needed to buy all the things he needed, because he would soon become a knight, to which Ricardo said that he would do so, and that she had no need to worry. But when the guy suddenly told the main character to rest as much as possible today, Greta was surprised, not understanding why her brother suddenly decided to talk about it, as if the girl looked tired or was acting strange. Placing his hand on the girl's head, the brother actually said that after yesterday her face was too tired, and therefore she needed to get some rest, cancel her classes, and devote the day only to herself. The girl smiled at her brother, saying that she would do so, and also thanking him for his concern and care. After this, the girl with golden hair anointed the departing carriage with Ricardo, wishing him a safe journey and already getting ready to spend the day without adventures and annoying people. However, as soon as all of Greta's relatives left home, the girl did not lie on the bed and do nothing, because now she thought only about escaping, which is why she put all her things in a suitcase as if she was late somewhere. In her head, The heroine remembered that, according to the plot, the evil Greta decided to become the princess's servant and not with good intentions, but in order to continue to ruin her life, she would seduce her favorites. Greta understands that she does not want to be the princess's maid at all because she is trying to escape from everyone. But even Joel's appearance was unexpected because he clearly wanted to lure her to himself, which the heroine remembered. In a hurry, taking the suitcase in her hands and heading for the exit, the girl said to herself that at this rate she would definitely be drawn into the original plot, and it would be best to leave the palace, leaving the characters as well. But she was quickly stopped by the cute teddy bears she saw on the windowsill, which were not just soft toys but a symbol of her father's love for her, because he loves her with all his heart, trying to pamper her not only with them but also with other things. And in the main character's memories, that very warm moment flashed when she was very little, and her father first gave her a blue teddy bear, which made the girl cry afterwards. But the heroine never got the chance to be alone, because suddenly someone knocked on the door, which made Greta want to turn around. And while the protagonist of the story looked suspiciously at the door, on the other side stood an agitated maid, knocking on the door, who shouted that something bad had happened, because an unexpected guest had come to see them. After some time, many of the maids were already standing in one room and were worried about something, looking at the interesting girl who had invited me to visit their house unexpectedly and without warning anyone. The thing is that a princess decided to come to Greta, who smiled at the heroine, saying that the tea party was excellent, but she came to her not for this reason, but for a more serious reason. The guest asked Greta if she had caused her any difficulties, to which the protagonist replied with embarrassment that this was not the case at all. But it was clear from her head that she was confused by her visit. A princess named Marielle was calmly drinking tea in the Lindhagen house and seemed to be in no hurry, which made an agitated Greta turn around, not understanding what this girl wanted from her and why she had come here. But this was only the beginning, because Marielle looked at the heroine with a smile and said that she had come here for a reason, because she was offering her to become her servant, a real maid, a servant in her house. Hearing this, the protagonist thought that she misheard, so she looked at the girl with big eyes, expecting to hear something more from her. For example, a joke or an awkward joke. Marielle continued to chatter about how they were the same age and therefore should be good friends. But Greta suddenly interrupted her, which caused the princess to stop her story and look at her puzzledly. Embarrassed, the girl with golden hair fixed her hair, saying that she could not be her servant because she was currently undergoing training to become the heir to the duchy and a true aristocrat. But when the main character was thinking that she would not allow herself to waste all the years spent in order to later become someone's servant, the princess suddenly stood up, causing her shadow to hang over the defenseless Greta. Marielle allowed herself to hit Greta without further ado, doing it so hard and shamelessly that the heroine was instantly surprised, already feeling how scratches were slowly appearing on her cheek, which was turning red. Touching her sore cheek, Greta looked at Marielle with a questioning expression on her face, trying to understand what she wanted to say and how she had allowed herself such impudence. But it was clear from Marielle that she didn't regret what she had done at all. On the contrary, she did it with an arrogant look, looking down on the girl as if she deserved it, allowing herself to refuse her. After that, pretending that nothing had happened, Marielle smiled, saying once again that she really wanted to make her her servant and any refusals would not be accepted because she knew a lot about her. Marielle's hand was still raised, but the princess only kept saying that not only would she not accept her refusal, but she would make her entire family, and especially her father, suffer greatly, to the point that she would regret her silence. The princess looked at her hand indifferently, as if she had only seen dirt on it, asking Greta if she knew why she had hit her just now. After that, the girl smiled at the heroine as if she was mocking not only her, but also everyone around her, and telling the protagonist that she raised her hand against her for the reason that she alone is the main heroine of this world and the center of everything. Greta was silently amazed by the princess's words when she said that if she still refused to obey, she would think of something else. And at that time, she also looked at the blue bear, which was lying near the ladies. Without even asking the main character's permission, Marielle took the toy as if it were her own, marveling at the beauty of the bear and looking at his sweet face, blue fur coat, and charming eyes. Noticing that the bear didn't look very new, the princess began to hug the bear, while Greta was telling him that her dad gave it to her and that this toy was dear to her. But Marielle only said that she realized that she loved her father very much. But as quickly as she took the bear in her hands, she threw it on the floor, saying with a smile that then she knew what to do with her, already intending to hit the main character in the very heart. The princess, having said that she knew perfectly well that her father was now on duty and guarding the borders of the country, where he would be there for about 2 or 1 month, warned that she could increase her father's term of service by 30 years. The girl's face instantly turned blue, and the heroine herself was shocked by the princess's words, asking how she dared to do such a thing to her father, who was not guilty of anything, and did not even suspect that Greta was in trouble, but speaking about how bad it is to serve on the border because there are constant wars there. The girl smiled, again warning that if she does as she says, then the hotel will be able to avoid difficulties. Greta wanted to object and therefore looked furiously at the princess and was about to say something mean to her, but she was quickly interrupted by Marielle, who asked again if she wanted to see her father. At that moment, she remembered all the most wonderful moments with her father, when he took care of her and gave her all sorts of gifts, giving her not only material wealth, but also warmth, love, and attention, which she so lacked. Noticing that the protagonist had become uncertainly silent, as if she had already accepted her position, the princess looked at Greta with a mocking look, asking if she would then become her servant of her own free will. Greta realized that she would not be able to escape from Marielle's manipulations, and so after a while they continued to sit on the sofas while the princess drank tea and pretended that everything was fine, but the situation was only getting worse. Marielle seemed to know that someone was about to arrive, and soon Ricardo entered the room, telling his sister that he had already returned, not yet knowing what had happened and who had decided to visit the Lindhagen's house. Ricardo did not lose his head, bowed to the princess, and told her that he was very glad to see her in their house, to which the girl responded with a smile, saying that she was pleased to see him in good health. And when Ricardo was telling the princess that yesterday they hadn't managed to greet her personally, he looked at Greta because he noticed something strange and unusual in her behavior, which made him look at her. Greta sat on the sofa and seemed lifeless, because with her eyes downcast, she was afraid to even look at anyone, while 2 slaps were already on her cheeks, scratching her sweet face. Ricardo quickly looked at Marielle with disapproval and amazement, as if he guessed that she was to blame for everything, but the princess only smiled, sweetly saying that Greta was fine and there was no need to worry. The princess even blushed, telling that in such a short time in the Lindhagen house, they had already managed to become friends. But Ricardo behind her did not believe a single word of the lady, suspecting her of something dark. Greta sat and preferred to remain silent with her head down when Marielle spoke instead of her, telling Ricardo that his sister had decided to become her maid herself, which amused her and made her smile. Ricardo was so shocked by this news that he did not know what to say, looking at the girl in amazement and not believing that he was hearing this in reality, because his beloved sister could not serve anyone. The guy looked at Greta and Marielle, who were hugging each other, but unlike the heroine, she smiled and acted very nice, telling the sad blonde that they would have a lot of fun spending time together. But Ricardo was not going to believe the princess's false emotions, because he only looked at his sister and asked her what had happened, not suspecting that even such a thing would be very scary to tell the girl. She only said with sadness and fear that it was her personal choice, and he shouldn't worry. Although the girl didn't smile even once the entire time her brother entered the room and noticed her devastation. Meanwhile, the princess already had her own plans, which is why she stood up from her seat with a smile and politely said that it was time for her to go, and that Greta herself needed to prepare for moving to the royal palace, since she was now her servant. The girl with brown hair asked the main character not to reveal the details of their conversation, but she turned to Ricardo, who finally decided to ask her if she could ask her one question. Clenching his hand into a fist, the boy said through his teeth whether the princess knew why his sister's cheeks were red, as if he no longer trusted her as much as before. Marielle said indifferently, saying that she didn't know at all why his sister's face was red, to which Ricardo sternly replied, saying that in that case he asked her to tell him about it if anything became known. The princess decided not to leave right away, asking Ricardo with a smile what he would do with the man who dared to hit his beloved sister so boldly, not even on one cheek, but on both at once. Then the guy replied that he himself was interested in what he would do with the offender of his sister. But the princess had already remembered Ricardo's words while in the carriage, when she was riding to her palace from the Lindhagen house, and was already dreaming of a luxurious life. Next to her sat a faithful butler named Fritz, who remained faithful to the princess, listening to her words about Ricardo being too sweet and kind. And she also twirled a lock of her hair around her finger, as if she was thinking about something deep. Fritz looked at the lady with incomprehension when she said that the villainess would still play her role, and all the secondary characters in the game would have to serve her for the good, for the sake of a wonderful life. She even looked at her reflection and began to laugh, smile broadly, saying that it was not in vain that she was reborn as Mariella in this game, and therefore she needs to do everything so that everyone around her would serve her for an ideal life. Marielle was sure that everyone would obey her now, but at that moment, one of her favorite secondary characters was thinking not about her, but about Greta, because he was taking care of her wounds on her cheeks, handing her a towel to cool her down. It was already quite late and dark, but Ricardo still tried to take care of his sister, who was holding a towel in her hands and thanking him for his help with a modest smile, as if this was the only thing that made her happy now. But the smile quickly disappeared from her face when her brother suddenly asked Greta if the princess had done this to her, referring to the noticeable redness on her cheek that did not disappear even after several hours. The protagonist was unable to answer anything, deciding to remain sadly silent. But her sister's silence only angered Ricardo, who looked at her with a murderous gaze and said that he would kill the princess. The main character looked at her brother in shock and said what he meant, having already taken Ricardo's threat seriously. But Greta never really knew what her strict brother was capable of. The girl wanted to explain to Ricardo that she was fine, and there was no need to be a hero. But her brother knelt down in front of her, saying that their father would never forgive her if he left his sister's offender alone. Ricardo felt perfectly well that the girl only wanted to calm him down with false words, and so he touched her cheek sweetly, saying that she shouldn't be strong because they all cared about her. Having said the girl's name, Ricardo did not hesitate to look into her eyes as if he was admiring her. Greta's brother was showing her that he truly wanted her to be happy, and therefore would not allow anyone to treat her so disrespectfully. And the heroine herself was no less surprised by her brother's warmth, which is why she looked at him with surprise. But Ricardo did not want to remove his hands from her cut face. The word is that now she is not a simple girl for him, but a person very close to his heart. But Ricardo did not want to stay in the heroine's room for long and therefore stood up, already getting ready to leave, telling the girl that such a serious expression on her face did not suit her, but she only asked him what he would do now. Then Ricardo turned to the protagonistka, asking her if the princess had said anything about her father, and only after hearing this did Greta become surprised, although before that she had wanted to calmly apply a cold towel to her sore cheeks. To calm the girl down, Ricardo said that their father was the strongest warrior among all, and therefore she should not worry about him, because he only needed to check the boundaries and return back. But talking about this only made the main character sad, which is why she hung her head and thought that she really wanted to believe in her dad's strength, but she was still afraid for him, because the princess had influence. In her head, the girl clearly remembered that Marielle leaned towards her and said that if she refused to be her servant, she would force her to remain in service for 30 years, if not more. Because of the nightmarish memories of the princess's threats, Greta could have cried out of despair, but she decided to show Ricardo her artificial smile, saying that everything was fine now. But Ricardo looked at the girl with shock when she happily, as if falsely, said that he should not worry about her, and now he needed to focus on his training, because he had to become a knight. Greta continued to play the joyful game, deciding to get out of bed and stretch, smiling and saying that he couldn't wait to become a servant in the royal house and become friends with the princess. Ricardo looked at the girl quite seriously, not understanding what she was getting at and asking her if she was serious, really not believing that his sister wanted to become Marielle's servant of her own free will. Greta continued to smile at the guy and say that she was behaving quite seriously, and also advised him to make friends with other knights, because she also intended not to sit here, but to get to know, for example, the princess. And when the heroine began to cheerfully talk about how he could find a girlfriend at work, Ricardo suddenly interrupted her, saying that he realized that she did not trust either him or her father, which is why the girl looked at him in surprise. Ricardo continued to look at his sister and explained to her that she did not have to become a servant if she could rely on them, or at least try to do so. At that moment, the girl began to say sweetly that she had just gotten something in her eye, and that was why she had covered her face with a towel, cheerfully saying that her redness would obviously not go away anytime soon, but the reason for her strangeness was far from her cheeks. In fact, she was crying, covering her eyes with the towel and telling her brother that in fact she has her own ways of fighting everything, and therefore she does not listen to anyone, because all she does is run away. Only after this did Ricardo leave the heroine's bedroom and close the door behind him, leaving his sister alone with her thoughts in a dark room, where only the furniture was slightly visible due to the light from the window. She continued to cry with her head down, saying that she was doing all this because she wanted a bright future for everyone, where she would no longer be there, because she would be leaving not only the aristocracy forever, but also the original plot of the game. And while the protagoniska quietly cried in her room, her father was doing his job, or rather, gathering his own detachment and checking everything, passing by the soldiers, wearing a chic officer's uniform. One dark-haired soldier decided to bow to the master and express her gratitude to him for having come such a long way for them. Vikram asked the soldier what the current situation was, to which the soldier replied that recently the number of attacks on traders had increased significantly, but he thought that such cases did not bother the hero, that is, Vikram. But Greta's father seriously replied that they needed to increase patrols on the roads. After Vikram seemed to have solved the problem with the attacks with a word, the blonde thoughtfully asked the soldier if this city was famous for its teddy bears, as if he already wanted to come up with something for his daughter. To this, the dark-haired soldier happily replied that in the city shops you could indeed find various soft toys, including teddy bears, to which the Duke replied that he understood him. Even though Vikram stood before the soldier with a serious face and folded his arms, he was thinking that if he stayed here for a long time, he would definitely need to buy a lot of teddy bears for his beloved daughter. The next day, the main character was already where she needed to appear, namely in the royal palace, where many servants had already gathered in one room, because the joyful princess intended to introduce them to a new colleague. Greta stood nearby in a modest pose while Marielle loudly called out her name and said that she would now be her personal servant. And while the servants were surprised by the new colleague, because they knew who Greta really was, the princess had already approached the protagonist, while she was smiling, telling herself to be calm and endure everything. Marielle, with a smile and false joy, took the heroine's hand and told the servants that she was not only her personal servant, but also a good friend, which surprised Greta silently, because she heard another word in her voice. The blonde began to look angrily at the smiling girl, who was sweet and charming to everyone, although the heroine only heard that she called her a slave, saying it quietly so that only Greta could hear the word. The princess behaved this way because she was sure that the whole world in the game belonged to her. If she was not only reborn as the main character, but also could conquer such handsome men as, for example, Ricardo, she considered her rebirth not just luck, but a direct hint that she should be a queen everywhere. Which is why, being in a purple dress, she was often surprised by her greatness and importance. Remembering the butler Fritz, Marielle realized that she had already managed to win his attention and trust as one of the main characters that she needed for a wonderful life without threats. But when she remembered Ricardo, she realized that he, like Alain, another important character, was very difficult to approach, and she did not understand why, because he too was supposed to fall in love according to the plot. And now, as he looks at Greta, who sheepishly submits to her and stands in front of the others, she realizes that the blonde villain is a real idiot, because she forced her to play by her rules too. Marielle was sure that her mission in this world was to guide all the secondary characters in the right direction, so she introduced Greta to the audience, which Fritz also watched, while everyone around was talking about Greta, how he was the daughter of the Lindhagen family. Fritz only silently drew conclusions, but the princess's strange decision did not make him even doubt that maybe she was not as kind as she seemed. So he adjusted his glasses with a smart look and looked at the girls. And so the first working day came for the main character, who was already a personal servant of the princess, who was having a pleasant time in the fresh air, because she was sitting in the gazebo and was going to drink tea. Greta was standing next to Marielle, who was sitting at the table and was serving her a teapot with tea and service, after which she bowed, for which the princess thanked her with a smile, enjoying the fact that her servant was her sworn enemy. The girl only looked at the princess with a slight rudeness, thinking in her head about a plan. Like if she still became Marielle's servant, she could avoid the events of the game that she was so afraid of. She recalled that in the original game, Greta used her connections to infiltrate the princess's palace, become her maid, and continue to torment her, showing only her devious smile. And when the heroine realized that, unlike the game's plot, she was not planning to mock Marielle, the princess herself called her to her with sweet eyes and a smile, already getting ready to mock her. Marielle gave the heroine a piece of paper, which she asked her to read carefully and remember, which the blonde did, carefully reading the paper with curious eyes that quickly ran over the words. But the girl just looked at the piece of paper with a blank expression on her face, because it had strange tasks written on it that she had to do. For example, serve burnt cookies, ruin makeup or a dress, serve tea with salt. When the main character asked the princess what it was, she just smiled and put her elbows on the table and said that this was all she needed to do today. Marielle, smiling and with her eyes closed, thought that she had to teach Greta how to be a real villain, and therefore gave her strange tasks. But the protagonist herself looked at her as if she was crazy. Greta assumed that the aristocrat was a real masochist, and therefore she hesitantly wanted to answer that she couldn't do it. But as soon as the blonde said this, the princess whispered just one word to her. That is, Dad. Then Greta changed her mind about saying anything, realizing that she had to do everything if Marielle asked her to. So she looked at her while the brunette handed her a cup and told her to pour tea into it. Greta realized that if she poured her tea, it would seem that she was mocking the princess. But she could not refuse her, and so the girl decided to drink the tea herself to the bottom, even if it was very hot. The princess, stunned by such an action, extended her hand to the girl, but she persistently continued to drink, not paying attention to Marielle's surprise. And while the princess looked at Greta in shock, her mouth open and not knowing what to say, the main character grabbed the teapot with tea in her hand. The girl even drank the tea from the teapot without hesitation in a few sips from her spout, trying to endure the boiling water and drink the last drops of tea intended for the princess. Not only the princess looked at the blonde in surprise, but also the other maids, who also had their mouths open in shock. But Greta didn't pay attention to them, finishing all her tea. After Greta had succeeded in doing what she had planned, she merely wiped her lips and cunningly turned to the princess, telling her that the tea was over and that she needed to make some more. The heroine said that due to the lack of tea, she would not be able to carry out her order. But the princess was even more surprised by every word the girl said, because she thought that she would unquestioningly follow every instruction. Leaving Marielle alone, the main character walked near the wall and headed somewhere with difficulty, because she still could not recover from the boiling water that she drank at once with just a few sips. Sometimes the girl looked at the piece of paper that the aristocrat had given her and clutched her head, not understanding how she could have written something like that, as if she wanted to be mocked. But the girl understood that now was not the time to think about what the princess wanted, because what she really wanted was to live in a lonely house in the forest with a cow, and before that, run away forever. The protagonist's thoughts were interrupted by the butler Fritz, who suddenly appeared behind her with a calm face and silence, and the girl remembered who it was, because this was the man who supported the princess in everything, was faithful to her. Greta was friendly towards him, turned to him and smiled, asking what was wrong and what he needed, but he only came closer to her, taking 2 quick steps, deftly and sternly. Greta never expected that the butler would not even greet her or say anything at all, but would immediately press her against the wall and block all possible escape routes with his large body. Blushing, the blonde with blue eyes looked at the man in shock and was frightened by how close he was to her, when she couldn't even bring herself to say anything because the princess's white-haired servant was piercing her with his gaze. The girl managed to think in such a short time that Fritz was a real handsome man, but he only shouted that he was very unhappy that she dared to drink all of his princess's tea, and if she did something like that again, he would kill her. Also looking at the lady with genuine anger, Greta realized that Fritz was simply obsessed with the princess, so she began to smile awkwardly at the man, thinking about what she needed to do so that the butler would stop seeing her as an enemy. But Fritz continued to stand in front of the heroine and tell her that he knew perfectly well that she had pushed the princess at the tea party, causing her to disgrace herself. And, according to the guy, he had put up with it, and Greta should thank Marielle for her kindness. Bending down to the blonde, the butler warned her once again that he remembered her terrible actions very well, and that he would not forgive her for them, even if the princess herself might have forgiven her for everything. After some time, the protagonist remembered this with shame and worry, lying on the bed in her own palace because her shift as a personal maid in the royal mansion ended. The girl was rolling around on her bed and was happy that finally the first day off had arrived, thanks to which she would be able to enjoy her home and lie down, because she missed her native palace. Remembering that she would have to return to the princess anyway, she recalled her sly smile and realized that this was the first time she had met a person who wanted to make fun of her. Also remembering how viciously Fritz warned her not to do stupid things, the girl realized that if she did everything as Marielle asked, the butler would kill her, as he had promised earlier. Just the memory of Fritz's face and his words made the girl shake with fear, which made her rub her forearms, telling herself that at this rate she would definitely create a new death flag for herself. She realized that she needed to describe her actions to them once again, so she sat down at the desk, taking a pen in her hand and already saying out loud that, first of all, it was important for her to understand that Dad was sent to patrol the border. When the lady realized that because of her father she had agreed to the princess's conditions, and because of her instructions Fritz was also targeting her, she grabbed her head, not understanding why she was making her life only worse and worse. And when the main character was already thinking about whether she should leave her dad and just run away from here, Ricardo entered her room with a basket of letters, saying that he did not want to disturb her and also apologizing for the surprise. The couple were talking sweetly to each other, but while the girl was looking at her brother, she couldn't notice that there had been a strange atmosphere between them lately, also remembering that her brother was probably training in a nightly order. Ricardo, without further ado, handed the girl a basket of letters, which made the lady look at her in surprise, since she saw a sufficient number of telegrams in front of her. Turning around, the guy said that all these letters were from her father and he was about to leave, saying that his business was over. But the blonde told him to stop, also extending her hand to him. But Ricardo didn't pay any attention to her, simply closing the door behind him and leaving the girl, which is why she lay down on the bed with displeasure, asking herself out loud what was happening to her brother and why he was so strange. Noticing that she had scattered all the letters from the shopping mall, the girl began to collect them in her hands with obscene remarks and shaking hands, as if asking her dad why he decided to send her a couple dozen letters at once, and not just one. Greta noticed that it seemed like everything had returned to the beginning, meaning that she was again moving away from Ricardo, as if at the first meeting, and with these thoughts the girl wanted to open the first letter that came across. Reading the letter carefully, the girl already praised how her father diligently wrote it while sitting at the table, telling on paper that everything was fine with him, that he had recently eaten fried fish that he had caught from the river, and that he also asked his daughter what she had eaten recently. Imagining a happy hug with her father, Greta read that her father missed her very much and wanted to hug her, because he was looking forward to the moment when he would come home and meet her. After reading everything that her father wrote to her in the letter, the girl only carefully folded the piece of paper back, saying that her father was really obsessed with his daughter if he kept sending her letters. Placing her hands on her torso, the girl doubtfully told herself that at this rate she would not even have a chance to escape if her father had become so attached to her that he now thought only of her. The girl, whose dreams were not at all connected with aristocracy and wealth, stood up and went to the window, thinking about the fact that her dad tells her everything he can in his letters because he misses her just as much. But no matter how sad the situation was, the heroine still confidently raised her index finger up and said to herself with a smile that she would destroy the death flag to protect her father. Remembering how the princess whispered her persuasions to her, how Fritz threatened her, and how in the end the girl was killed by Ricardo himself, the lady realized that she was challenging fate, trying to take it into her own hands and change it to her advantage. However, when the girl realized that if she had become friends with her brother, then she could become friends with others, she sat down at the table and asked herself if she could form an alliance with Mariella. Having drawn something in the notebook, the girl happily raised it in front of her and realized that if she could deal with Mariella, she would no longer have to endure her bullying and follow the plot. Greta drew herself and Mariella in ink, holding hands and smiling, because now the protagonist realized that a great plan was born in her head about how to get closer to the princess of the kingdom. And while the main character was making plans for the future, her father was already racking his brains over how to surprise his beloved daughter, and so he dressed up in a bear costume, doubting that Greta would like it. And behind him stood a stunned soldier. A few days later, the protagonist showed up at the royal palace to serve Marielle, seeing her sitting at the table while the maids were already crowding around her, bringing her everything she needed for a delicious tea. Intending to befriend the princess, the blonde with blue eyes smiled at the aristocrat and wished her good morning, also holding a white box in her hands, similar to a gift. Marielle also wished the girl the same, asking what she was holding in her hands, since the smiling beauty was clearly not telling the princess something when she showed her a cute box. Bending down, Greta said that this was a gift for her personally, which caused a surprised Marielle to try to take the white one with the red ribbon in her hands, asking the maid if it was really for her. The princess was a little embarrassed when Greta said that she made this gift especially for her, to which the girl smiled, gasping with delight, although in fact she already suspected the maid of something bad. Marielle was about to open the gift with a smile, untying the red ribbon with a smile, because she remembers that according to the plot, Greta was supposed to give her a gift, but with unpleasant contents. Having opened it and lifted the lid, the girl saw in the box not only various cookies, but also a scarf with a picture of a rose with a pink bud. The first thing the princess did was open the cookie and show it to the maid, ordering her to try it, to which the girl agreed, although hesitantly. The maid took the first cookie in her hand and bit into it hesitantly, tasting it with caution, because she already assumed that she was being used to check what was wrong with the food. Marielle looked at her with a smile and anticipation, as if the maid was about to say that the cookies were very tasteless or even poisoned, and the maid really intended to say something. But the maid did not even hide her face from the unpleasantness, because she exclaimed that the cookies were incredibly tasty and she liked them very much. Hearing this, the princess just opened her mouth in surprise, looking at the maid with wide eyes, because until that moment she was sure that the maid would say the opposite. Greta clapped her hands, smiling as if to say that she was very glad that everyone liked her cookies, since she had tried so hard to make them. But the princess still looked at the maid with such displeasure, as if she had said the wrong thing. Following the displeasure, anger appeared on Marielle's face as she looked at the maid and stole from her whether the cookies were really tasty, as if she really didn't want it. Then the girl, unhappy with the situation, decided to look at the scarf, which was also in Greta's gift, as if she also expected something bad from it, which is what she needed. Remembering that Greta probably put a needle in the handkerchief so that she would prick herself, since that is what happened in the original story, the princess immediately grabbed the gift in her hands and began to touch it with a grin. The girl's fingers continued to touch the scarf with roses, but she never felt anything sharp with them, which made her seem disappointed, because it turned out that Greta really did give her nice things. The other maids were also interested in the cookies, so the heroine gave them cookies as well, which caused them to whisper that Greta cared for the princess and loved her. Showing her own cookies to the girls, the heroine said that she really wanted them all to become friends, and that's why she was treating them. Blushing with embarrassment, the girl with blue, kind eyes told the maids to enjoy her cookies, because she had prepared them especially for them. The beauty's words and care made her friends embarrassed, covering their mouths in surprise, because they were very pleased to feel Greta's kindness, which they had never expected from her before, because there were rumors that she was an evil aristocrat. And even now the maids began to smile, to say in front of the seated princess that Greta was not at all like they say about her. Marielle herself looked at them with negative emotions. She just squeezed the handkerchief given to her by Greta with displeasure, because she really doesn't like the fact that the heroine positions herself as a good girl and not a true villain, which she should be according to the plot. After such a strange incident, the main character walked down the corridor as if nothing had happened, but noticed a mirror on her way, in which she looked at herself. Noticing the dark circles under her eyes, the girl began to carefully cover them with powder, telling herself that it was precisely because she had been baking cookies all night. The protagonist also put white gloves on her palms, because her hands were also covered in bandages and bruises, continuing to talk to herself, and if she had to continue to carry out the plan and not give up. The girl, confident in her plans, raised her hand up and said that if she continued to give Marielle gifts, she would definitely love her. But at that time, she did not suspect that Fritz was standing quietly next to her. This time, Fritz was not going to threaten Greta because he heard her talking to herself and smiled, realizing that the heroine was trying her best to please the princess. And while Fritz was happy that Greta was striving for peace and friendship, the main character entered the dressing room, because earlier the princess had given her another task. She remembered in her mind Marielle, who with a smile asked her to go to the dressing room to check if she had any yellow dresses. So the girl with golden hair looked at the dress with pleasure, wondering whether the princess had begun to trust her if she had let her into her dressing room. The girl also looked with curiosity at the bag in her hands, which Marielle herself had previously given to the girl with the words that if something went wrong with her, she should open it. But since the girl was confident that everything would be fine with her, she just began to spin around in a yellow dress in a dance, humming melodies and happily realizing that she would become friends with Marielle faster than she thought. However, no matter how happy she was with everything around her, when Greta realized that no task had yet been completed, she clenched her hands into fists, sternly angry and telling herself that now was not the time to relax. She tried to approach the door and open it, but she couldn't do it, which is why she nervously pulled the handle and shouted, asking why it wasn't opening if it had been open before. It was useless for Greta to try to leave the room because on the other side of the door handles there was a board that did not allow the doors to open even a millimeter. In the end, Greta gave up, sitting sadly by the door and sighing as if she no longer understood what to do next. But at that moment, the girl suddenly remembered the bag that the princess had given her, and so she took it in her hands, examining it with curiosity. The girl decided to open it. Val felt something heavy inside it, and when she did this, she picked up the crooked scissors, which she looked at, not understanding why Marielle decided to give them. At this time, Marielle was calmly drinking tea and waiting for her personal maid, using the scissors she had been given to do what she had given her such a strange surprise for. Imagining the torn dresses in her head, the princess remembered that according to the plot, the villainous Greta visited the dressing room in order to destroy all her dresses with scissors. So the evil Marielle thought with a smile that if she recreated this situation by giving her the scissors, She would definitely make Greta awaken her true, sinister personality. At the same time, Duke Vikram couldn't stop thinking about Greta, looking at the live bear and asking himself if he would be able to take it to the palace for the sake of his daughter, who liked bears.